The last shadow of the Ottoman Empire does not fall all at once. It stretches slowly across old stone walls, railway stations, empty barracks, crowded docks and villages, where people still speak of the Sultan as if his name can hold the world together. In Istanbul, the domes of great mosques still rise over the Bosporus, and the call to prayer still moves through the city as it has for centuries. Ships still cross between Europe and Asia. Courtiers still pass through palace gates. Officials still stamp documents in ministries that carry the weight of an empire. On the surface, the old order remains visible, dignified, almost permanent. But beneath that surface, something vast is coming apart. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire is no longer the unstoppable frontier power that once frightened Vienna, ruled the eastern Mediterranean, and bound together lands from the Balkans to Arabia. It is still enormous, still complex, still capable of survival in ways its enemies often underestimate. Yet it is also surrounded by rivals, burdened by debt, shaken by rebellion, and haunted by the memory of territories already lost. Its rulers know that the empire cannot simply remain what it was. Its soldiers know that older methods no longer guarantee victory. Its subjects know that identity, loyalty, religion, and language are beginning to mean different things than they once did. Scholars still debate whether the empire's fall was inevitable, but what survives in the record suggests something more unsettling than simple decline. It was not one wound that killed the Ottoman world. It was a long accumulation of pressures, each one manageable for a time, until together they became too heavy to bear. The empire stands at the meeting point of continents, and this is both its ancient strength and its late weakness. For centuries its geography gave it power. It controlled passages, ports, caravan routes, fertile plains, mountain corridors, and sacred cities. It linked the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, the Balkans to Anatolia, Syria, to Egypt, Arabia, to the wider Islamic world. But in the age of steamships, railways, industrial armies, and European empires with global reach, location becomes a trap as much as a gift. Every frontier matters to someone else. Russia looks south toward warm water routes and influence over Orthodox Christians. Britain watches the eastern Mediterranean and the road to India. France claims interests in North Africa and the Levant. Austria-Hungary fears instability in the Balkans. Germany arrives later, ambitious and eager to build influence through advisors, weapons and railways. The Ottoman Empire is not merely weakening in isolation. It is weakening in a world where other powers are growing stronger, richer, faster and more intrusive. Inside the empire, daily life carries on with remarkable diversity. In one province, peasants work fields under tax arrangements that have changed again and again. In another, merchants bargain in Greek, Arabic, Armenian, Turkish, Ladino, Kurdish, Slavic languages and more. In port cities, newspapers circulate new political ideas with dangerous speed. In the deserts, tribal leaders negotiate with Ottoman officials whose authority may be real in one season and thin in another. In the Balkans, churches, schools and local committees become quiet engines of national awakening. In Istanbul, reformers argue that only a modern state can survive. In the provinces, many people experience reform not as salvation, but as new taxes, new conscription, new bureaucracy, and new interference from distant officials. The evidence remains incomplete in many local cases, but the pattern is clear enough. The empire is trying to become more centralized at the very moment many of its peoples are imagining futures outside the imperial frame. There is a strange sadness in this phase of Ottoman history because it is not a story of simple backwardness. The empire reforms, it experiments, it builds new schools, reorganizes its army, sends students abroad, prints laws, opens ministries, adopts technologies, and tries to speak the language of modern sovereignty. Ottoman statesmen are not unaware of the danger around them. Many understand it with painful clarity. They know that European military power comes from industry administration, finance, discipline, education, and scientific training, not merely from bravery on the battlefield. They know that old privileges and local arrangements make central control difficult. They know that foreign creditors can become as dangerous as foreign soldiers. Yet knowing the problem is not the same as solving it. Reform costs money. Reform disrupts older elites. Reform creates expectations. Reform can strengthen the state, but can also reveal how uneven and fragile that state has become. One lesser-known detail of this late Ottoman world is how much of its modern appearance is built under pressure rather than confidence. Railways, telegraph lines, military academies, and new administrative maps often appear as symbols of progress, and in many ways they are. But they are also tools of anxiety. A railway can move soldiers quickly to a rebellious province. A telegraph can bring news of defeat to the capital in hours instead of weeks. A census can help tax and conscript, but it can also force people into sharper categories of identity. A modern school can produce loyal officials, but it can also produce young men who read revolutionary texts and dream of overthrowing the very system that educated them. No single explanation fully accounts for this contradiction. The Ottoman state modernizes to survive, yet modernization changes the empire's internal chemistry. The human cost is already visible before the final collapse. Refugees move across shrinking borders carrying stories of lost farms, burned homes, abandoned mosques, churches and graveyards. Muslim families flee from lands that had once been Ottoman for centuries. Christian communities fear repression, suspicion and revenge. Armenians, Greeks, Arabs, Kurds, Albanians, Bulgarians, Serbs, Turks, Jews, Circassians and many others live through an age in which imperial belonging grows less secure. The state still speaks of order, loyalty and protection, but its ability to protect all its subjects equally is increasingly questioned. Violence spreads in cycles often local in origin, but imperial in consequence. Each crisis makes the next compromise harder, and still the empire survives longer than many expect. This is one of the most important clues in the story. European observers often describe it as dying, yet it continues to govern, negotiate, fight, adapt, and endure. Its officials are skilled at playing rivals against one another. Its religious legitimacy still matters deeply to millions. Its capital remains one of the great cities of the world. Its army, though repeatedly defeated, is not useless. Its provinces, though restless, are not all ready to break away at once. The Ottoman Empire falls not because it is already dead, but because it remains alive in a world that keeps forcing it into impossible choices. At the edge of the 20th century, the empire resembles an ancient bridge under too many armies, merchants, refugees, debts, memories, and ambitions. Some stones are cracked, some arches have been repaired, some foundations are older than anyone can remember. From a distance, it still spans the water. Up close, the strain is everywhere. To understand how it fell from power, the story has to move backward to the centuries when the same empire was not a symbol of weakness, but one of the most formidable powers on earth. Long before the empire becomes a problem for European diplomats to manage it, begins as something far smaller and more dangerous, a frontier power in motion. Its early world is not yet the world of imperial palaces, formal ministries and ceremonial decline. It is a rougher landscape of borderlands, fortresses, migrating warriors, farmers, dervishes, merchants, captives and shifting loyalties. In northwestern Anatolia, where Byzantine authority has thinned and rival Turkish principalities compete for land and followers, The Ottoman house rises not from certainty, but from opportunity. The evidence for the earliest decades remains incomplete, and later, Ottoman chroniclers often reshape beginnings into legend, but what survives suggests a small dynasty skilled at turning instability into strength. The Ottomans grow first on the edge. That edge matters. They're close enough to Byzantine territory to raid, conquer, trade, and absorb. They're close enough to other Turkish powers to borrow institutions, rivals, soldiers, and ideas. They are close enough to the old Roman world to inherit roads, towns, tax systems, and symbols of legitimacy. Their early rulers do not build power by purity. They build it by flexibility. They attract warriors seeking plunder, local notables seeking security, religious figures seeking patronage, and communities that prefer an energetic new ruler to a distant or weakening old one. The frontier is violent, but it is also porous. Men cross it, families cross it, customs cross it. The future empire is born in this mixed zone where conquest and accommodation are never completely separate. One of the surprising features of Ottoman expansion is how practical it often is. Later stories sometimes imagine a simple clash of civilizations, but the early Ottoman frontier is more complicated. Christian soldiers serve Muslim rulers. Muslim rulers make agreements with Christian towns. Byzantine nobles marry into Turkish dynasties. Local populations may resist bargain or adapt depending on taxes, security, and elite politics. Ottoman success comes partly from military energy, but also from the ability to make conquest feel administratively useful. A captured town is not merely looted and abandoned, it can become a tax base, a garrison, a market, and a symbol. Land is distributed, but not always randomly. Service is rewarded. Local elites can sometimes keep influence if they accept the new order. What begins as a frontier principality becomes a machine for absorbing territory. The military side of this rise is essential. Ottoman warfare combines mounted frontier raiders, disciplined infantry siegecraft, and later, the formidable household troops of the Sultan. The famous Janissaries recruited through the Devshirme system from Christian boys in the Balkans and trained for service to the ruler become one of the most distinctive military institutions of the empire. To modern ears, the system carries an obvious harshness because it takes children from families into imperial service, and no account should soften that. Yet within the Ottoman structure it also creates an elite core loyal not to a local lord or tribe but directly to the Sultan. Some rise to great power as soldiers, administrators, and grand viziers. This is one of the paradoxes of the empire at its height. Coercion and opportunity exist in the same institution, and scholars still debate how different communities experienced it across time and place. The conquest of Constantinople in 1453 transforms Ottoman power from regional force into imperial destiny. The city has already been weakened by centuries of war crusade, economic contraction, and political isolation, but its symbolic weight remains immense. When Mehmed II takes it, he does more than capture walls. He claims the inheritance of Rome controls a strategic passage between seas and gives the expanding Ottoman state a capital worthy of its ambition. The city becomes Istanbul in practice and imagination, though older names continue in different languages and contexts. Its churches, palaces, markets, harbours, and neighbourhoods become part of a new imperial design. The Hagia Sophia becomes a mosque. New mosques and complexes rise. Populations are resettled to revive the city. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities are drawn into its economic life. The empire now has a centre strong enough to organise the edges. From there, Ottoman power expands in several directions at once. In the Balkans, it moves through valleys, river systems, fortresses, and dynastic rivalries. In Anatolia, it absorbs competing Turkish principalities and confronts other Muslim powers. In the Arab lands, especially after the defeat of the Mamluks in the early 16th century, the empire gains Syria, Egypt, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina through its control over the Hijaz. This changes the meaning of Ottoman rule. The Sultan is not only a conqueror on the edge of Europe, he becomes protector of major Islamic sacred spaces and ruler of some of the richest and most historically layered lands in the Eastern Mediterranean. Egypt brings grain revenue and prestige. Syria brings cities tied to trade, scholarship, and pilgrimage. Arabia brings religious legitimacy that later rulers will lean on heavily when political legitimacy weakens. Trade routes also give the empire power, though not always in the simple way imagined. The Ottomans do not completely control all trade between East and West, but they dominate crucial corridors and ports. Goods move through Ottoman lands: silk, spices, grain, timber, metals, textiles, horses, slaves, and luxury objects. Caravans and ships connect inland cities to the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Customs revenues matter. So do the relationships with Venetian, Genoese, French, and other merchants who seek access to Ottoman markets. The empire is not sealed off from Europe, it is deeply entangled with it. European states fight the Ottomans, trade with them, fear them, imitate parts of them, and negotiate with them. This entanglement will later become a source of vulnerability, but in the age of expansion it helps make Ottoman power feel unavoidable. At its strongest, the Ottoman system is not merely military, it is administrative. Land taxes, law, and hierarchy are organized through layered arrangements that vary by region. The Timar system links cavalry service to revenue from land, though its form changes over time. Imperial law exists alongside Islamic law and local custom. Religious communities manage many internal affairs under broader Ottoman authority, though the later idea of a fixed millet system can be too neat when applied to earlier centuries. What survives in the record suggests a flexible imperial habit: govern differently, where difference is useful, standardize where standardization strengthens the center, and never allow any local power to become too independent for too long. This is why the empire becomes so difficult to break. It does not depend on one people, one landscape, or one economy. It is a structure of movement and incorporation. Its armies cross mountains and rivers. Its officials count households and harvests. Its judges hear disputes. Its architects leave stone signatures in cities from Bosnia to Damascus. Its scribes turn conquest into paperwork. Its rulers understand that power is not only the moment a fortress falls, but the years afterward when taxes are collected, roads remain usable, markets reopen, and the conquered begin to live inside a new political reality. Yet the very strengths that build the empire contain future dangers. A frontier state that thrives on expansion must eventually face the limits of expansion. A military system that is innovative in one century can become rigid in another. A ruling elite drawn from many backgrounds can serve the center brilliantly, but can also become a guarded caste with interests of its own. A system built to manage diversity can endure for centuries, but when new ideas of nationhood arrive, diversity can become a battlefield. The Ottoman rise is not separate from the Ottoman fall. The same geography, institutions, and imperial habits that allow it to grow across continents will later expose it to pressures from every direction. For now, though, the empire is still climbing. Its enemies do not yet speak of sickness. They speak of danger. They watch its armies, its fleets, its tax collectors, its engineers, and its sultans with alarm. The Ottoman world has crossed from frontier principality into empire, and its next challenge is not simply to conquer, but to hold together the immense human mosaic it has gathered under one imperial roof. At the height of Ottoman power, the empire is not a single uniform place, but a vast arrangement of differences held within a single imperial frame. From the Danube frontier to the deserts of Arabia, from the mountain villages of Anatolia to the ports of the eastern Mediterranean, the Sultan's authority rests on something more subtle than force alone. Armies can win territory, but they cannot by themselves make farmers plant merchants trade, judges rule, priests serve imams, preach shipwrights, build, or tax collectors return with revenue year after year. The Ottoman achievement is not only that it conquers, it learns how to make conquest last. Istanbul sits at the centre of this order like a stone weight holding down a great tent. The city is both capital and symbol, both administrative machine and sacred stage. Its palaces contain the rituals of dynasty. Its mosques display the confidence of imperial Islam. Its markets gather goods from distant provinces. Its scribes turn petitions, appointments, tax registers and military orders into the written nervous system of power. The Topkapi Palace is not merely a residence. It is a world of controlled access, trained servants, guarded ceremonies and political calculation. The Sultan is physically hidden more often than he is seen, and this distance increases the aura around him. Power works partly through visibility and partly through mystery. The empire's balance depends on a careful management of hierarchy. At the top stands the Ottoman dynasty, whose continuity becomes one of the state's greatest assets. Beneath it are military administrative elites, religious scholars, judges, provincial governors, tax farmers, guild leaders, tribal chiefs, village headmen and community representatives. Their authority overlaps, sometimes cooperates and sometimes competes. No single explanation fully accounts for how this system works across all regions, because Ottoman rule in Hungary is not identical to Ottoman rule in Egypt, and neither is identical to rule in central Anatolia or Yemen. The empire is too large, too old, and too varied for a single administrative pattern. Its strength lies partly in that variation. Religious diversity is one of the empire's most important realities. Muslims hold the commanding ideological position in the state, and Islamic law and legitimacy matter deeply. Yet millions of Christians and Jews live under Ottoman rule for centuries. Greek Orthodox communities, Armenian Christians, Jews in major cities, Balkan Catholics, Syriac Christians, Maronites and others occupy different legal and social positions depending on time and place. They pay taxes, run businesses, maintain schools and religious institutions, and sometimes rise to important economic roles. The empire does not offer modern equality in the later sense. It is hierarchical, patriarchal, and legally differentiated. But it often allows communities to survive with their institutions intact as long as they acknowledge imperial authority and fulfill obligations. What survives in the record suggests a practical tolerance shaped less by modern ideals than by the needs of rule. One lesser-known detail is how much of Ottoman stability depends on negotiation at the local level. A village may know the empire through taxes, conscription demands, courts, and occasional officials rather than through grand imperial ceremony. A mountain district may obey when it must and resist when it can. A tribal confederation may accept titles and gifts while preserving considerable autonomy. A city guild may protect its privileges through petitions. Provincial notables may become indispensable intermediaries between the state and local society. The empire is not always a heavy hand pressing evenly downward. Often it is a web of bargains. When the bargains hold, the empire appears stable. When they fail, the centre discovers how much of its authority is dependent on cooperation it cannot easily command. The law itself reflects this layered world. Ottoman governance combines Islamic jurisprudence, sultanic regulations, local custom, and administrative necessity. Judges or qadis are central figures recording disputes, marriages, property transfers, debts, inheritances, and complaints. These court records, where they survive, offer glimpses into ordinary life rarely visible in battlefield histories. Women appear in these records more often than some might expect, buying property, pursuing inheritance claims, managing endowments, or bringing disputes before the court. This does not mean Ottoman society is egalitarian, but it does complicate the image of a silent population hidden beneath imperial politics. The empire is filled with people using the law in practical ways, often with patient strategy and a sharp sense of their own interests. For centuries, the Ottoman military remains a pillar of this balance. The army is not only a fighting force, but a social institution, a career path, a political actor, and a financial burden. The Janissaries cavalry forces, artillery corps, naval units, engineers, and provincial troops all form part of a system that evolves over time. In earlier centuries, Ottoman artillery and siegecraft are among the most advanced in the world. The conquest of fortified cities, the use of disciplined infantry, and the coordination of campaigns across great distances show a state capable of impressive organization. The empire's enemies learn to respect this capacity. Sometimes they learn it painfully. The Mediterranean and Black Sea worlds also reflect Ottoman balance. Control over ports and sea lanes allows the empire to project power tax trade and contest rivals. Ottoman fleets battle Venice, Spain, the Habsburgs, and other maritime powers. North African corsair states linked in varying degrees to Ottoman authority extend the empire's reach and complicate European security. In the Black Sea for a long period, Ottoman power helped shape a relatively closed commercial zone. Grain slaves, timber fish, and other goods move through networks tied to imperial control. Yet even here, the balance is never static. Sea power requires ships, timber-skilled crews, artillery money, and constant adaptation. A navy that dominates one era can struggle in another if its rivals innovate faster. At the height of the empire, diplomacy becomes as important as conquest. The Ottomans make treaties, receive ambassadors, grant trade. Privileges threaten war and exploit rivalries among European powers. France may seek Ottoman friendship against the Habsburgs. Venice may fight and trade in alternating cycles. Poland, Lithuania, Russia, Austria, Safavid Iran, and other powers all occupy places in the strategic imagination of Istanbul. The empire is never outside Europe's political system. It is one of the forces shaping it. European powers may describe the Ottomans as alien, but their own diplomacy often reveals something else they know. The empire is a major actor, whose friendship or hostility can alter the balance of the continent. Still, the imperial balance requires constant maintenance. Succession struggles, palace factions, provincial revolts, corruption, inflation, military mutiny, and frontier pressure are not late inventions. They exist even when the empire is strong. The difference is that a powerful empire can absorb shocks that would destroy a weaker one. A rebellion can be crushed. A corrupt official can be replaced. A lost battle can be answered with another campaign. A rebellious province can be punished or bargained back into obedience. This system has reserves of authority, revenue, legitimacy, and fear. But history often changes first at the edges of what seems stable. The empire's balance depends on conditions that are slowly shifting. European states are becoming more fiscally organized and militarily competitive. Oceanic trade routes are altering older commercial patterns, though not as suddenly or completely as older decline stories once claimed. Firearms, fortifications, drill finance, and bureaucracy are changing the nature of war. Provincial elites are finding ways to turn imperial service into local power. The Janissaries are becoming more deeply embedded in urban society and politics. Tax farming grows in importance. The centre still commands, but command travels through increasingly complicated channels. The Great Ottoman balance is therefore not a frozen golden age. It is a living system, adaptable and impressive, but also vulnerable to time. Its success creates habits. Its habits create interests. Its interests resist change. For generations, the empire can manage this tension. It can bend without breaking. Yet the very fact that it has held so many peoples, provinces and frontiers together makes every future crack more dangerous. When pressure increases, it will not strike one wall. It will move through the whole structure, from palace to province, from battlefield to treasury, from local grievance to imperial crisis. The first cracks behind Ottoman splendour do not appear as one dramatic break. They spread quietly through habits that once worked, institutions that once inspired fear, and frontiers that once promised expansion. The empire still has power, its armies still march, its officials still collect revenue, its capital still shines with ceremony, learning, trade and faith. Yet somewhere between confidence and crisis, the old rhythm begins to falter. The empire is not suddenly weak, and it is not simply asleep. It is adjusting more slowly than the world around it is changing. For a long time, Ottoman strength has depended on movement. Conquest brings land revenue, prestige, captives, soldiers, and legitimacy. Victorious campaigns reward warriors and confirm the Sultan's aura. But as the empire reaches harder, frontiers expansion becomes more costly. The Habsburg lands in Central Europe are not easy prey. Safavid Iran remains a stubborn eastern rival. The deserts, mountains, and distant provinces demand garrisons, diplomacy, and money. A state built partly around expansion must now master the more difficult art of consolidation. It must pay for defence without the same flow of new conquest. It must maintain loyalty without constant victory. This is one of the deeper shifts beneath the surface, and scholars still debate exactly how early it becomes decisive. War itself is changing. European rivals develop larger standing armies, new drill systems, improved fortifications, heavier fiscal machinery, and more coordinated military supply. The Ottomans are not ignorant of firearms or artillery. Earlier Ottoman armies had used them with great effect. The problem is not that the empire never innovates. The problem is that innovation becomes harder to sustain across a large, politically complex system. New weapons require new training, new factories, new budgets, new officers, and new discipline. Every reform touches someone's privilege. Every change in military organization threatens men who have a stake in the old order. The Janissaries, once a symbol of disciplined imperial power, gradually become entangled in urban trade's political factions and resistance to reforms that might reduce their influence. No single explanation fully accounts for their transformation, but by the later centuries their role is far more complicated than the image of an elite battlefield corps. The treasury feels these changes sharply. War grows expensive, and the old land revenue arrangements do not always meet the demands of the age. Tax farming expands, giving individuals or groups the right to collect revenue in exchange for payments to the state. In theory, this can bring ready money to the treasury. In practice, it often strengthens local power brokers who squeeze peasants, bargain with officials, and turn temporary rights into lasting influence. Provincial notables become harder to control. Some serve the state well. Others behave like semi-independent rulers. The empire remains administratively alive, but its authority must increasingly pass through intermediaries who have their own ambitions. In the countryside, these pressures are felt not as abstract decline, but as burdens on ordinary lives. A farmer may experience imperial weakness as heavier taxation. A village may experience military reform as new conscription. A town may experience fiscal crisis as corruption among officials desperate to raise money. Records from different regions reveal petitions, complaints, lawsuits, and local struggles over land and revenue. What survives in the record suggests that many people do not think in terms of the empire rising or falling. They think about harvests, debts, security soldiers, officials, and whether the next demand from the state can be endured. Trade is also shifting, though not in the simple way once told. Older histories often claimed that oceanic routes around Africa instantly ruined the Ottoman economy by bypassing eastern Mediterranean trade. The reality is more gradual and more complicated. Ottoman ports remain active. Merchants continue to profit. Cairo, Aleppo, Istanbul, Izmir, Salonika, and other cities remain important commercial centres. Yet the balance of global wealth is changing. Atlantic powers draw silver plantation goods and colonial profits from far beyond the Mediterranean. European commercial companies gain new reach. Industrial and financial systems begin to develop in ways that give Western Europe increasing advantages. The Ottoman Empire is not cut off from this world, but it participates under conditions that slowly become less favourable. Inflation adds another wound. The flood of silver from the Americas into global markets affects prices across Europe and the Ottoman lands. Coinage, wages, taxes, and military salaries become sources of tension. Soldiers paid in money find that money buys less. Officials manipulate currency. Urban unrest can follow. A lesser-known but important detail is that some Ottoman crises are connected not only to battles and sultans, but to the movement of metal through early modern global economies. A miner in the Americas, a merchant in Seville, a money changer in Istanbul, and a janissary demanding pay can all be part of the same invisible chain. The palace itself changes as well. The image of decline is often unfairly attached to individual sultans, as if one weak ruler after another simply ruins a once great machine. The truth is more structural. Succession practices evolve. Court politics become more enclosed. The imperial household, queen mothers, palace factions, chief eunuchs, religious authorities, and high officials all play roles in government. Some sultans are capable, others less so, but the dynasty remains surrounded by a political world in which access matters enormously. Decisions are shaped not only by grand strategy, but by personal networks, rivalries, patronage, and fear. This is not unique to the Ottomans. All early modern empires live through such politics. But in a state under growing pressure, court faction can become especially costly. At the frontiers, the psychological map begins to change. For centuries, Ottoman armies advancing into Europe had given the empire the aura of a power pressing outward. Failed sieges, lost campaigns, and hard treaties begin to reverse that feeling. The failed siege of Vienna in 1683 becomes a symbolic turning point, though not the whole story by itself. The following wars with the Habsburgs and their allies bring major losses, especially through the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, which forces the empire to surrender significant territories in Central Europe. This is not the end of Ottoman power, but it is a profound signal. The empire can lose not only battles but provinces. The frontier can move backward. The shock is not merely military, it affects imagination. An empire that has long understood itself as a victorious order must now explain defeat. Some blame moral decay, some blame corrupt officials, some blame military backwardness, some blame divine displeasure, some look to European methods with reluctant admiration, others see imitation as humiliation. The debate over reform begins here in a deeper form, not as a fashionable desire to modernize, but as a struggle over survival and identity. How can an empire borrow from its enemies without admitting inferiority? How can it change without ceasing to be itself? These questions never fully disappear, and yet even amid these cracks, the Ottoman Empire does not collapse. That is part of what makes the story so compelling. It absorbs defeats, regroups, reforms in bursts, and remains a major power. Its enemies are often divided, its provinces still produce revenue. Its religious legitimacy remains meaningful, its diplomats are skillful, its people continue to live trade worship and adapt under imperial rule. The cracks are real, but the structure still stands. The danger is that each repair leaves marks. More taxes to solve military problems create local anger. More reliance on provincial notables weakens the centre. More borrowing from European methods intensifies arguments over identity. More defeats invite foreign intervention. More centralization disturbs older bargains. The empire is not falling yet, but the old ease is gone. From this point onward, Ottoman power increasingly becomes an act of management under pressure, and the next great pressures will come from wars that redraw maps, empty villages fill roads with refugees, and teach both the empire and its enemies that the old balance has changed. The wars that change the Ottoman Empire do not merely remove pieces from a map. They change the empire's sense of what is possible. They teach its rulers that defeat can become permanent, that lost provinces may not return, that European alliances can turn a local crisis into an imperial wound, and that the old machinery of power must now face enemies whose armies, treasuries, and diplomatic networks have grown increasingly formidable. The empire had always fought wars. War is woven into its rise, its frontier identity, and its imperial prestige. But from the late 17th century onward, war begins to feel different. It becomes less a road to expansion and more a test of survival. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 marks one of the great psychological breaks. After long conflict with the Holy League, the Ottomans surrender large territories in Hungary, Transylvania, Croatia, and elsewhere. The empire remains vast, but the direction of movement has changed. For earlier generations, frontiers were places where Ottoman authority pressed outward. Now in Central Europe, the frontier retreats. That retreat is not simply geographical. It unsettles assumptions inside the ruling class. The empire has lost before, but this is loss formalized on paper, recognized by treaty, witnessed by foreign powers, and remembered by those who understand that diplomacy can preserve defeat as effectively as armies create it. The Habsburg frontier becomes one long school in painful adaptation. Fortresses must be defended, rebuilt, supplied, and sometimes abandoned. Soldiers require training and pay. Commanders face enemies who are improving coordination between infantry, cavalry, artillery, engineers, and logistics. Ottoman courage is not the issue. Many soldiers fight with determination under harsh conditions. The deeper problem is organization. A battle is only the visible moment at the end of a much longer chain: taxation, transport, weapons, production, discipline, medical care officer, training, intelligence, and political will. If any links weaken, bravery cannot compensate forever. What survives in the record suggests that many Ottoman officials understand this, but reforming the chain is far harder than recognizing its flaws. Russia becomes an even more dangerous rival because its ambitions press directly against Ottoman vulnerabilities. For centuries, the Black Sea had been strongly shaped by Ottoman power, and by the Crimean Khanate, an Ottoman vassal and major regional force. But as Russia expands southward, the balance changes. The struggle is not only about land, it is about access to warm water routes, influence over Orthodox Christians, control of steppe zones and prestige. The Russian Empire presents itself at times as protector of Orthodox subjects under Ottoman rule, a claim that gives diplomacy a religious edge and turns internal Ottoman diversity into an international issue. This pattern will become one of the most damaging features of the empire's later history. Foreign powers discover that they can use the empire's communities as excuses for intervention. The Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca in 1774 is especially severe. After defeat by Russia, the Ottomans accept terms that weaken their position around the Black Sea and recognize the independence of the Crimean Khanate, though Russia soon absorbs Crimea outright. The treaty also gives Russia openings to claim a protective role connected to Orthodox Christians, a matter whose precise legal meaning remains debated by historians, but whose political consequences are unmistakable. A lesser-known detail is how deeply Crimea's loss affects the Ottoman imagination. This is not a distant borderland of minor value. It is tied to Muslim power, Black Sea security, and centuries of military partnership. When Crimea is annexed by Russia in 1783, the empire loses not just territory but a shield. The wars create refugees as surely as they create treaties. Muslim populations from Crimea, the Caucasus, the Balkans and other contested lands move into remaining Ottoman territories over generations, often under desperate conditions. They carry grief, resentment, memories of violence and expectations that the Ottoman state will protect them. Their arrival reshapes towns, villages, politics and identity. It also deepens a defensive imperial mood. The state sees itself not only as a ruler of diverse peoples, but increasingly as a refuge for Muslims pushed out of lands lost to Christian powers. This does not explain everything that follows, and it must not be used to flatten the experiences of Christian subjects within the empire, but it becomes an important emotional and political layer in the late Ottoman world. In the Balkans, war and rebellion begin to merge. Local uprisings, great power intervention, and imperial weakness feed one another. The Serbian uprisings in the early 19th century begin as resistance within an Ottoman provincial context, but develop into a broader movement for autonomy. The Greek War of Independence brings the pattern into sharper international focus. Greek rebels fight against Ottoman authority, and European Phil-Hellenic sympathy transforms their cause into a continental issue. Britain, France, and Russia eventually intervene, and the destruction of the Ottoman Egyptian fleet at Navarino in 1827 reveals once again how local revolt can become international humiliation. Greek independence is not merely the loss of a province. It proves that European intervention can help detach Christian lands from Ottoman rule. Egypt adds another complication. Under Muhammad Ali, the province becomes a powerful semi-independent state, with modernizing ambitions of its own. His armies challenge the Ottoman center, seize Syria for a time, and nearly threaten Istanbul itself. The crisis is astonishing because it shows that danger no longer comes only from European enemies or rebellious Balkan Christians. It can also come from within the imperial structure, from an ambitious governor who uses reform more effectively than the center. European powers intervene to preserve the Ottoman state not out of love, but because they fear what might happen if the balance collapses too quickly. This is one of the empire's strangest later patterns. It survives, partly because rival powers cannot agree on how to divide the consequences of its failure. The Crimean War in the 1850s briefly reverses the mood. Britain and France fight alongside the Ottomans against Russia, and the empire appears integrated into the European diplomatic order. Ottoman statesmen hope this alliance proves that the empire can remain a recognized sovereign power. Yet victory brings no simple recovery. The war is expensive. Foreign loans deepen financial dependence. European officers, advisors, journalists and creditors become more present. The empire gains protection, but protection comes with scrutiny. It is treated as a partner when useful, and as a patient when convenient. The phrase later attached to the empire, "the sick man," captures this insulting ambiguity, though the empire is never as passive as the phrase suggests. Then comes the catastrophe of 1877 and 1878. War with Russia brings devastating defeat. Russian forces advance through the Balkans and into eastern Anatolia. The Treaty of San Stefano initially threatens to create a huge Bulgarian state under Russian influence, alarming other European powers. The Congress of Berlin revises the settlement, but the damage remains immense. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro gain full independence. Bulgaria becomes autonomous. Bosnia-Herzegovina is occupied by Austria-Hungary. The empire's European lands shrink dramatically, and waves of Muslim refugees pour into what remains. The war leaves financial strain, political bitterness, and a clear message: the Ottoman Empire can no longer defend its territories without accounting for the ambitions of all Europe. No single war destroys Ottoman power. Instead, each conflict removes a layer of confidence and adds a layer of dependency. Defeats lead to reforms. Reforms require money. Money leads to loans. Loans invite foreign control. Territorial losses create refugees. Refugees alter politics. Foreign intervention encourages nationalist movements. Nationalist movements provoke repression. Repression invites further foreign pressure. The chain is not mechanical, but it is persistent. The empire is caught in a pattern where even survival carries a cost. By the late 19th century, Ottoman rulers face a world in which war has transformed from an instrument of greatness into a recurring emergency. The battlefield exposes weaknesses, but it also creates new ones. Maps shrink, debts grow, communities harden, European powers learn the routes into Ottoman affairs. And in the provinces, especially in the Balkans, another force is gathering strength, one that cannot be defeated by a single treaty or army, because it lives in schools, churches, newspapers, songs, memories, and the increasingly powerful idea that people should belong not to an empire but to a nation. Nationalism enters the Ottoman Empire like a new language for old grievances. It does not create every tension by itself, and it does not arrive everywhere at the same speed, but once it begins to spread, it changes the meaning of loyalty. A village complaint about taxes can become part of a national struggle. A church dispute can become a political question. A school can become a battlefield without weapons. A newspaper can make distant strangers imagine themselves as one people. For an empire that has survived by managing difference, this is profoundly dangerous. Difference had always existed. Nationalism gives difference a sharper edge. In earlier centuries, many Ottoman subjects understand belonging through religion, locality, dynasty, profession, family, and community. A person may be Orthodox Christian, Muslim, Armenian, Jewish, Greek-speaking, Arabic-speaking, Albanian-speaking, Slavic-speaking, Kurdish-speaking, a merchant of one town, a farmer of one valley, a member of one guild, a client of one notable, and a subject of the Sultan all at the same time. These identities overlap. They do not always compete. The Ottoman state depends on that overlap. It does not need every subject to feel the same kind of loyalty. It needs obedience, tax revenue, legal order, military service where required, and acceptance of imperial authority. But nationalism begins to insist that language, ancestry, culture, and territory can define a political destiny of their own. The Balkans become the most explosive zone because they sit at the meeting point of local unrest, imperial weakness, religious institutions, European influence, and competing historical memories. Greek nationalism develops in connection with language education, Orthodox networks, merchant wealth, and European romantic admiration for ancient Greece. Serbian nationalism grows through rebellion, church life, epic memory, and local autonomy. Bulgarian national consciousness develops partly through schools' printed books and the struggle for an independent church hierarchy separate from Greek ecclesiastical influence. Romanian, Albanian, and other movements follow their own paths, each shaped by local conditions. Scholars still debate how quickly ordinary villagers embrace national identities compared with educated elites, but the direction is clear. The empire's older categories are being reinterpreted. One lesser-known detail is that nationalism often spreads through institutions that do not look revolutionary at first glance. A school teaching a standardized language can be as important as a rebel band. A church appointment can matter as much as a battlefield. A printed grammar, a history textbook, a folk song collection, a village reading room, a scholarship to study abroad, or a newspaper smuggled across a border can help build a national imagination. In some places, rival national movements compete for the same population, especially where language church affiliation and local identity do not line up neatly. Macedonia becomes one of the most tangled examples where Bulgarian, Greek, Serbian, Ottoman, and later other claims overlap violently. The evidence remains incomplete for many rural communities, but it suggests that identity was often pressured, negotiated, and sometimes forced. European powers deepen the problem by turning Ottoman diversity into diplomatic leverage. Russia claims concern for Orthodox Christians and Slavic peoples. Austria-Hungary watches South Slav nationalism with anxiety, while expanding influence in Bosnia. Britain and France speak at times of protecting Christian minorities, though their concerns often move with strategic interest. Missionaries, consuls, merchants, and newspapers all help internationalize local issues. When violence occurs, reports travel quickly and selectively. Some atrocities become famous in Europe. Others receive less attention because they do not fit the politics of the moment. This uneven outrage matters. It convinces many Ottoman officials that humanitarian language can disguise imperial ambition, while many subject communities conclude that foreign attention may be their best protection. For the Ottoman state, nationalism produces a cruel dilemma. If it grants autonomy, it may encourage further separation. If it refuses reform, it strengthens the argument that only independence can bring justice. If it represses rebellion, it invites foreign condemnation and intervention. If it centralizes administration, it disrupts older local privileges. If it preserves older communal arrangements, it appears outdated and unequal. No single policy can solve the problem, because nationalism is not merely a demand for better administration. It is a rival idea of political legitimacy. This does not mean every non-Turkish or non-Muslim subject wants immediate independence. Many continue to live within the empire, trade within it, serve it, and even defend it. Armenians, Greeks, Arabs, Albanians, Jews, Kurds, Slavs, and others occupy complex positions that cannot be reduced to rebellion. Some elites seek reform rather than separation. Some communities fear what would happen if the empire collapses and rival national movements gain power. Some people are attached to local life more than ideological programs. What survives in the record suggests a world of mixed loyalties, changing expectations and practical calculations. The empire does not simply face nations already formed and waiting to escape. It faces the process by which national movements form, compete, and harden. In the Arab provinces, nationalism develops differently and later in a mass political sense. Arabic-speaking lands are central to Ottoman legitimacy, especially because of the holy cities, the pilgrimage routes, and the empire's Islamic identity. Many Arab notables serve the Ottoman state. Cities like Damascus, Beirut, Jerusalem, Baghdad, and Cairo before its semi-independent path are tied to broader Ottoman networks. Yet reform centralization, new schools, missionary education, printing, and provincial politics gradually create new forms of Arab cultural awareness. Some intellectuals emphasize Arabic language and heritage. Some demand decentralization, not independence. Some remain loyal to an Ottoman Islamic framework. Arab nationalism before World War I is real but varied, and historians still debate its depth and reach outside educated circles. It is not the same phenomenon as Balkan nationalism, but it adds another layer to the empire's identity crisis. Among Muslims, too, nationalism complicates older loyalties. Albanian nationalism emerges among both Muslims and Christians, unsettling Ottoman assumptions that Muslim populations will automatically remain loyal. Turkish identity, long less politically central than dynastic and religious identity, begins to take on new significance among some intellectuals, especially after repeated losses in the Balkans and the arrival of Muslim refugees. Kurdish leaders respond to centralization in diverse ways, sometimes cooperating, sometimes resisting, sometimes pursuing local autonomy. The empire discovers that Islam can unite many people, but it cannot erase all ethnic, linguistic, and regional ambitions. The emotional consequences are severe. As national movements grow, neighbors may begin to look at one another differently. A village that once contained overlapping loyalties can become divided by schools, priests outside committees, armed bands, and rumours. Maps drawn in foreign capitals turn mixed regions into coloured blocks, as if each colour represents a single people living neatly in place. Reality is messier. In many Ottoman lands, populations are interwoven. A town may have Muslim quarters, Christian quarters, Jewish streets, shared markets, mixed languages, and memories that do not fit a clean national border. When empire weakens, the question of who owns the land becomes terrifying, because no answer can satisfy everyone. The Ottoman response shifts over time. Some reformers try to create an inclusive Ottoman citizenship, an identity that might bind Muslims and non-Muslims under equal legal status, and shared loyalty to the state. This idea, often called Ottomanism, is ambitious and in some ways modern. It recognizes that the old hierarchy may not survive the nationalist age, but it struggles against suspicion from all sides. Many Muslims fear losing their privileged position in an Islamic empire. Many Christians doubt that equality will be real or lasting. Foreign powers continue to intervene. National activists see Ottomanism as a tactic to delay independence. The ideal is powerful on paper, weaker in the villages and frontiers where violence and mistrust are already spreading. By the late 19th century, nationalism has become one of the great engines of Ottoman decline, but it works slowly, unevenly, and often through crisis. It does not simply break the empire from outside. It transforms the empire from within, altering how people imagine community history and the future. The state can still command armies, pass laws, and negotiate treaties, but it cannot easily command imagination. And once millions of people begin to imagine that empire is not the natural container of their lives, Ottoman power must fight not only for territory, but for meaning itself. The Ottoman reformers do not enter the 19th century as dreamers decorating an old empire with borrowed European language. Many are practical men facing practical dangers. They see armies, defeated provinces, lost creditors, circling nationalist movements, growing, and foreign diplomats using every internal weakness as a doorway into imperial affairs. Reform is not a luxury. It is a defensive act. The empire must become more centralized, more predictable, more financially organized, and more legible to itself if it is to survive. Yet every attempt to repair the state also disturbs the fragile arrangements that have held it together for centuries. The Tanzimat era, usually dated from 1839 to 1876, begins with a promise of renewal. The Imperial Decree of 1839 issued at Gulhain speaks of security for life, honour and property, fair taxation, regular conscription, and lawful administration. Later reforms expand the language of equality among Ottoman subjects regardless of religion. These ideas sound clean and orderly when written in official documents. In practice, they enter a world of entrenched privilege, local autonomy, communal suspicion, and uneven state capacity. What survives in the record suggests that reform is experienced very differently depending on where one stands. A bureaucrat in Istanbul may see a necessary modernization of sovereignty. A provincial notable may see a threat to inherited influence. A peasant may see new officials, new taxes, and new obligations. A non-Muslim merchant may see legal opportunity mixed with fear that promises will not be protected. A Muslim townsman may see the old hierarchy being unsettled. One of the deepest aims of reform is centralization. The state wants to know its population count, its resources, regulate taxation, conscript soldiers, standardize administration, and reduce the independence of local power holders. This is a modern ambition, but it is also dangerous. For generations, Ottoman authority has often worked through negotiation. Local notables, tribal leaders, religious authorities, and provincial families have helped translate imperial power into local realities. They are not simply obstacles, they are part of the machinery. When Istanbul tries to rule more directly, it may strengthen the state in theory while provoking resistance in practice. No single explanation fully accounts for the success or failure of Tanzimat reforms, because the empire is too varied for one outcome. Some regions are integrated more tightly, others remain difficult, remote, or resistant. The army is at the heart of this transformation. Earlier reform attempts had already shown how dangerous military change could be. Sultan Selim III's efforts to create a new style army in the late 18th and early 19th centuries provoked resistance from entrenched forces including Janissary interests, and he eventually lost his throne. Mahmud II later destroys the Janissary Corps in 1826, in a violent rupture remembered as the Auspicious Incident, though the name hides the bloodiness of the event. The Janissaries had once been an elite instrument of conquest. By this time they had become politically powerful, economically embedded, and deeply resistant to reforms that threatened their privileges. Their destruction clears the way for a new army, but it also reveals the scale of the problem. Reform can require not persuasion, but violence against institutions that once defined the empire's strength. Military modernization demands schools, uniforms, drills, barracks, weapons officers, medical systems, and supply chains. It creates new kinds of men, officers trained in technical subjects, bureaucrats who think in maps and statistics, doctors shaped by modern science engineers who see the empire as something to be measured and improved. These men often become carriers of new political ideas. A military academy can produce loyal servants of the Sultan, but it can also produce critics who believe the palace is blocking the empire's salvation. This is one of the Tanzimat's hidden contradictions. The state builds modern institutions to defend itself, and those institutions produce people capable of imagining a different state. Law becomes another field of reform. New commercial courts, penal codes, administrative councils, and legal procedures appear. The empire tries to make itself understandable to European powers and to its own subjects. The old combination of Islamic law, sultanic regulation, and local custom does not disappear, but it is increasingly joined by new legal forms. The promise of equality for non-Muslims is especially important. Reformers hope that if Christians and Jews are made equal, Ottoman citizens' nationalist separatism will weaken, and European powers will lose excuses for intervention. But equality is easier to declare than to make real. Many Muslims resent the erosion of their superior legal status. Many non-Muslims doubt that the state can protect them from local hostility or official inconsistency. Foreign governments continue to claim protective roles anyway. The reform meant to solve the minority question often exposes how deep the question has become. A lesser-known but crucial part of reform is paperwork. Modern states live through documents. The Ottomans expand censuses, identity papers, land registration, provincial reporting, and official correspondence. This may sound dry, but it changes how power reaches ordinary people. Land registration can protect ownership, but it can also allow taxation, conscription, and state intrusion. Census categories can help administration, but they can also harden identities. Identity papers can make travel and service more orderly, but they also make the individual more visible to the state. The empire is learning to see its subjects in new ways. Its subjects in turn are learning how to evade, manipulate, or challenge that gaze. Education reforms widen the transformation. New secular schools appear beside older religious education. Translation bureaus, medical schools, military academies, and civil service training institutions create a new bureaucratic class. Students encounter French political thought, European science, constitutional ideas, and new historical narratives. Print culture expands. Newspapers, journals circulate debates about liberty, law, religion, progress, and patriotism. The state wants educated servants, but education cannot easily be confined to obedience. Ideas move faster than decrees. The Tanzimat also changes the physical empire. Roads, telegraphs, ports, and later railways strengthen communication between centre and province. A message that once took weeks can move in hours by telegraph. A governor can report unrest quickly. A ministry can issue orders more directly. Soldiers can be deployed with better coordination where infrastructure allows. These are real improvements. Yet the same technologies spread news of defeat, scandal, massacre, and revolution. They connect provincial activists to global ideas. They make the empire more integrated and more politically nervous at the same time. The reformers' greatest dream is Ottomanism, the creation of a shared imperial citizenship strong enough to hold together Muslims and non-Muslims, Turks and Arabs, Armenians and Greeks, Slavs and Albanians, Jews, and others under one legal identity. It is a bold answer to the nationalist age. Instead of breaking into nations, the empire might become a modern political community. But Ottomanism faces history's hard weather. In the Balkans, many Christian national movements no longer trust imperial promises. Among many Muslims, especially after territorial losses and refugee suffering equality, can feel like betrayal rather than unity. In foreign capitals, diplomats praise reform while continuing to interfere. The idea is not foolish. It may be one of the empire's most serious attempts at survival, but it arrives late and it must grow in soil already salted by war. By 1876, a constitution briefly appears promising parliamentary life and a new political horizon. For a moment it seems the empire may remake itself as a constitutional monarchy, but war crisis and the fears of the throne soon close that opening. The parliament is suspended. Autocracy returns under Abdulhamid II. Still, the reform era cannot be erased. It has created new institutions, new expectations, new educated elites, and new contradictions. The empire is more modern than before, but not necessarily more secure. It has become more centralized, but also more contested. It has promised equality, but not fully delivered trust. It has learned the language of modern statehood while discovering that language can be used by its own critics. The Tanzimat does not fail completely, and it does not save the empire completely. Its legacy is more haunting than either verdict. It shows an empire struggling intelligently against decline, yet trapped by the fact that reform itself has consequences. To modernize is to disturb. To centralize is to provoke. To promise equality is to awaken demands. To educate is to create critics. To borrow methods from stronger powers is to admit quietly, but unmistakably, that the old world cannot defend itself alone. Money becomes one of the quietest instruments of Ottoman decline because it rarely arrives with the drama of cavalry charges or burning cities. It comes as contracts, interest payments, customs, arrangements, concessions, bonds, commissions, and foreign signatures on documents that seem technical until they begin to shape the empire's freedom of action. By the 19th century, the Ottoman state does not only face enemies at its borders, it faces creditors inside its budget. The empire can still raise armies, issue decrees, reform schools, and appoint governors, but increasingly it must do so while looking over its shoulder at European banks, bondholders, merchants, and governments that understand finance as a path to power. The roots of the problem are older than any single loan. War is expensive. Reform is expensive. Centralization is expensive. Modern armies require regular salaries, imported weapons, factories, uniforms, barracks, roads, doctors, engineers, and trained officers. Administrative reform requires ministries, clerks, schools, courts, provincial offices, censuses, land surveys, and communication networks. Even survival costs money. When the empire loses territory, it loses tax bases. When refugees arrive, they need land, food, settlement, and security. When rebellions break out, troops must be moved and supplied. The Ottoman treasury is asked to fund a modern state before the empire has the industrial and fiscal foundations that make such a state sustainable. For much of its earlier history, the empire had used internal systems of revenue tax farming, debasement, extraordinary levies, and negotiation with elites to meet financial needs. These methods could be harsh and unstable, but they were largely imperial tools. In the 19th century, foreign borrowing becomes increasingly important, especially during the Crimean War. At first, loans seem like rescue. They provide quick money in a crisis and allow the empire to fight reform and appear as a participant in European finance. But loans carry time inside them. They solve today by binding tomorrow. Interest accumulates. New loans cover old obligations. Confidence depends on foreign markets. The empire's weakness becomes measurable, tradable, and profitable. The Ottoman debt crisis reaches a breaking point in the 1870s. After years of borrowing and fiscal strain, the state suspends payments on much of its foreign debt in 1875. This is not merely an accounting failure. It is a humiliation with political consequences. European creditors demand guarantees. Foreign governments pressure the empire in the name of bondholders. The empire that once dictated terms to defeated enemies now finds parts of its revenue discussed in financial circles beyond its control. The evidence remains incomplete in the sense that no ledger can fully capture the social pain behind fiscal collapse, but the broad pattern is clear. Debt narrows sovereignty. In 1881, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration is established, giving representatives of foreign creditors control over specific revenue streams used to service the debt. These include income from sources such as salt, tobacco, stamp taxes, and certain customs revenues. The institution becomes one of the most striking examples of indirect control in the late Ottoman world. It does not replace the Ottoman government. It does not fly a foreign flag over Istanbul. It does something subtler. It takes part of the empire's financial bloodstream and channels it toward creditors under international supervision. A lesser-known detail is that this administration becomes highly efficient in collecting revenue, sometimes more efficient than Ottoman offices themselves, which only deepens the sense that foreign financial structures are operating inside the empire with disturbing competence. This kind of control changes the meaning of independence. The Ottoman state remains legally sovereign, its sultan still rules, its ministers still govern, its soldiers still march under Ottoman banners, yet certain decisions are constrained before they are even made. A government that cannot freely command its own revenues cannot freely choose its future. It must consider creditworthiness, foreign reaction, bond prices, trade, privileges, customs limitations, and the anger of powers whose citizens hold Ottoman debt. The empire is not colonized in the direct manner of Algeria under France or India under Britain, but it becomes partially enclosed by financial dependency. No single explanation fully accounts for the empire's weakness, but debt is one of the locks on the door. Trade dependence reinforces this enclosure. European manufactured goods increasingly enter Ottoman markets, while many Ottoman regions export raw materials, agricultural products, and semi-processed goods. Capitulations, originally diplomatic and commercial privileges granted to foreign merchants in earlier centuries, become more damaging in the age of European dominance. What had once been a manageable tool of diplomacy now limits the state's ability to regulate foreign subjects' tariffs and trade on equal terms. European merchants benefit from legal protections and consular courts. Local producers face competition from industrial goods manufactured in economies with far greater capital and machinery. Ottoman crafts and industries do not simply vanish everywhere, but many are pressured, reshaped, or weakened. Port cities reveal both vitality and vulnerability. Izmir, Beirut, Salonika, Istanbul, and other urban centres become deeply connected to global commerce. Warehouses, banks, insurance offices, steamship agencies, consulates, and foreign schools appear alongside older markets and neighbourhoods. Wealth grows for some. New middle classes emerge. Non-Muslim merchant communities often play major roles in these networks, partly because of language skills, family connections, and access to European legal protections. This can produce resentment, especially when economic difference overlaps with religious and ethnic identity. The empire's economy becomes more connected to the world, but connection does not mean equal power. It often means exposure. Railway concessions show the same pattern. Railways promise military mobility, economic integration, and administrative reach. Ottoman rulers, especially Abdulhamid II, understand their importance. A railway can carry troops to a frontier, pilgrims toward the holy cities, grain to ports, and officials into provinces. But railways require capital and technical expertise, and much of that comes from foreign investors. Concessions grant rights, guarantees, and influence to European companies, especially French, British, Austrian, and later German interests. The famous Berlin to Baghdad railway becomes not just an infrastructure project but a geopolitical signal. Germany sees opportunity. Britain sees a possible threat to routes toward India and the Persian Gulf. The Ottoman Empire sees a chance to strengthen itself, but the tool of strengthening draws more foreign rivalry into its body. Financial dependency also affects reform. Every modernizing project must be paid for, and every payment raises questions. Should the state fund schools or soldiers? Should it build roads or pay debts? Should it invest in provincial security or satisfy creditors? Should it raise taxes and risk unrest, or borrow again and deepen dependence? These are not abstract choices. They shape whether a village sees a new school, whether a regiment receives modern rifles, whether a famine response is adequate, whether refugees are settled peacefully, whether officials are paid enough to resist corruption. Fiscal weakness becomes administrative weakness, and administrative weakness becomes political danger. The social consequences are uneven. Some Ottoman subjects profit from global trade, foreign investment, and new commercial law. Others are pushed into debt migration or dependence on cash crops. In parts of the empire, peasants become more exposed to market fluctuations they cannot control. A bad harvest, a shift in prices, or a predatory tax farmer can destroy fragile households. In cities, new wealth stands beside visible poverty. The empire's integration into world capitalism produces modern neighborhoods, banks and docks, but also sharper inequalities. Scholars still debate the balance between opportunity and exploitation in different regions, because the Ottoman economy is not one simple story. Still, the direction of pressure is unmistakable. By the late 19th century, European power no longer needs to arrive only through invasion. It can arrive through a loan agreement, a railway concession, a customs rule, a protected merchant, a consular court, a debt commission, or a diplomatic note written in the language of financial responsibility. This is why the Ottoman fall from power cannot be understood only through battles. Some of the most decisive defeats happen in offices on paper, in budgets that do not balance, and in revenues pledged before they reach the state. The empire continues to breathe, but more of each breath is measured by others. It can still act, yet its actions are increasingly priced. It can still reform, yet reform deepens the need for money. It can still borrow, yet borrowing confirms weakness. In this tightening financial world, the old imperial question changes. It is no longer only whether the Ottomans can defeat their enemies, it is whether they can remain masters of their own house, while the keys to so many rooms are held by creditors, companies, and powers waiting just outside the door. By the time European diplomats begin speaking of the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, the phrase does more than insult a weakened state. It reveals a whole way of looking at the empire as if it were not a living political world filled with millions of people, but a problem on a conference table. The empire is still there. It still governs taxes, negotiates, builds, imprisons, reforms, censors, educates, and fights. Yet in the imagination of its rivals, it becomes increasingly defined by the question of what will happen when it fails. That question is called the Eastern Question, and it turns Ottoman weakness into a permanent subject of European strategy. The phrase sick man is often associated with Tsar Nicholas I of Russia. In the mid-19th century, though the exact language and later retelling are tangled, its power lies in the image. A sick man can be pitied, managed, exploited, protected, or robbed before death. He is not treated as an equal. He is watched for symptoms. His household is discussed by outsiders. His inheritance becomes a matter of speculation. For the Ottoman Empire, this image is dangerous because it encourages other powers to think of Ottoman lands not as sovereign territory, but as future prizes, buffer zones, spheres of influence, or bargaining chips. Yet the European powers do not agree on what they want. That disagreement helps the empire survive. Russia often wants greater access to the Straits' influence in the Balkans and a stronger position in the Black Sea and eastern Anatolia. Britain wants to prevent any single rival, especially Russia, from dominating the route toward India and the eastern Mediterranean. France has interests in Catholic communities, North Africa, trade prestige and influence in the Levant. Austria-Hungary fears the spread of Balkan nationalism, while also seeking its own expansion into Ottoman Europe. Later, Germany sees the empire as an opportunity for military partnership, railway projects, and global ambition. Each power speaks in the language of order. Each power calculates advantage. This is one of the strangest features of late Ottoman survival. The empire is weakened by foreign interference but also preserved by foreign rivalry. If Russia presses too far, Britain may support the Ottomans. If one settlement threatens the balance, another Congress revises it. If the empire seems close to collapse, diplomats worry that the collapse will unleash a war among themselves. The Ottoman state learns to live inside this rivalry. Its diplomats become skilled at delay appeal, concession, and balance. They cannot always win, but they can sometimes prevent a worse defeat by making Ottoman survival useful to someone else. The Congress of Berlin in 1878 shows this pattern with painful clarity. After the disastrous war with Russia, the initial Treaty of San Stefano threatens to reshape the Balkans in ways that alarm other European powers. A large Bulgarian state under Russian influence would give St. Petersburg immense leverage. Britain and Austria-Hungary object not because they are committed to Ottoman dignity, but because they fear Russian advantage. Berlin revises the settlement. The Ottoman Empire recovers some diplomatic ground compared with San Stefano, but still loses heavily. Independence for Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro is recognized. Bulgaria gains autonomy. Bosnia-Herzegovina is occupied by Austria-Hungary. Cyprus comes under British administration through a separate arrangement. The empire is saved from one version of disaster by powers that impose another. The language of protection becomes one of the main tools of intrusion. European governments claim concern for Christians, Catholics, Orthodox believers, Armenians, Maronites, Jews, or other groups depending on context and interest. Sometimes the concerns are connected to real suffering. Ottoman misrule, local violence, discrimination, and massacres are not inventions. But humanitarian language often travels with strategic calculation. A consul's report can become a diplomatic weapon. A massacre can become an argument for reform intervention or occupation. A reform plan can become a way to place foreign inspectors inside Ottoman provinces. No single explanation fully accounts for European intervention because moral outrage and imperial ambition are often mixed together in proportions that shift from case to case. For Ottoman rulers, this creates deep suspicion. If they accept foreign pressure, they appear weak. If they reject it, they invite stronger pressure. If they promise reforms for a minority community, Muslim conservatives may resent the concession, and local officials may resist implementation. If reforms fail, Europe claims proof that intervention is necessary. If reforms succeed, foreign powers may claim credit and demand more. The empire becomes trapped in a diplomatic theatre where even internal policy is judged before an international audience. A lesser-known detail of this era is how many foreign eyes are present across Ottoman lands. Consuls in provincial cities gather information, cultivate local allies, report unrest, and represent commercial or religious interests. Missionaries establish schools and hospitals, especially in parts of Anatolia, Syria, and the Balkans. Archaeologists, travellers, military advisors, engineers, bankers, and journalists move through the empire, each carrying their own assumptions. Some are genuinely curious or sympathetic. Others view Ottoman society through racial, religious, or imperial prejudice. Their writings shape European public opinion, often simplifying complex local realities into stories of oppression, backwardness, heroism, or decay. The Ottoman Empire is also made into an object of reform by outsiders. European diplomats demand better treatment of Christians, more efficient administration, financial discipline, and legal guarantees. Yet these same powers often protect their own privileges under the capitulations, weaken Ottoman tariffs, support separatist clients, and benefit from financial dependency. The empire is told to become modern while being denied full control over the tools of modern sovereignty. This contradiction is not lost on Ottoman statesmen. Many understand that Europe's advice is rarely innocent. The sick man image also affects how Ottoman subjects see their own future. For nationalist movements, European belief in Ottoman decline can be encouraging. If the empire is expected to fall, then rebellion may seem historically justified. If foreign powers are likely to intervene, local leaders may frame their causes in ways designed to attract European sympathy. At the same time, Muslim populations become increasingly anxious, especially after seeing what happens when Ottoman rule retreats. Refugees from lost lands carry memories of expulsion, massacre, dispossession, and abandonment. To them, European diplomacy does not look like liberation. It looks like a machine that breaks Muslim security wherever Ottoman power weakens. In Istanbul, officials confront not only the fact of weakness, but the performance of weakness. European ambassadors can speak with a confidence that previous centuries would not have allowed. Foreign newspapers discuss Ottoman affairs with condescension. Financial commissions oversee revenue. Naval demonstrations can threaten the capital. Reform proposals arrive with deadlines. Maps are drawn elsewhere. The empire's sovereignty becomes real, but conditional, formal, but compromised. The humiliation is not only practical, it is emotional and symbolic. Still, the sick man image is misleading in one crucial way. A sick man does not usually reorganize armies, build railways, educate officers, suppress revolts, negotiate alliances, and survive repeated crises for generations. The Ottoman Empire is weakened, but it is not inert. Its leaders make choices, some clever, some brutal, some desperate, some disastrous. Its people are not merely victims of European schemes. They organize, resist, collaborate, migrate, trade, and imagine futures of their own. The empire is acted upon, but it also acts. The danger of the sick man phrase is that it turns a complex imperial struggle into a deathbed scene. By the late 19th century, European diplomacy has made Ottoman decline both a reality and a habit of thought. Every crisis is interpreted through the expectation of eventual collapse. Every reform is judged by whether it can postpone collapse. Every lost province confirms the diagnosis. Every survival merely delays the predicted end. This expectation becomes part of the pressure itself. An empire believed to be dying finds it harder to borrow without conditions, harder to command respect, harder to satisfy minorities, harder to deter enemies, and harder to convince its own subjects that loyalty has a future. The Ottoman state continues, but it now lives under observation. Its sickness is named by others, debated by others, and exploited by others. Yet inside the old capital, another ruler will attempt to turn weakness into endurance. He will use religion, railways, spies, censorship, schools, diplomacy, and fear to hold the empire together for one more generation. His name is Abdulhamid II, and his reign will show how survival itself can become an authoritarian art. Abdulhamid II inherits an empire that has already learned the taste of humiliation. When he comes to power in 1876, the Ottoman state is shaken by debt rebellion, constitutional hope palace intrigue, and the gathering storm of war with Russia. The empire he receives is not a sleeping giant waiting for one strong hand. It is a wounded structure surrounded by creditors, national movements, suspicious European powers and provinces, where loyalty depends on fear, faith, interest, and memory in different measures. Abdulhamid's long reign becomes one of the most controversial attempts to preserve that structure. To some, he is the last ruler who truly understands the danger and keeps the empire alive against impossible odds. To others, he is an autocrat whose suspicion, censorship, and violence poison the empire's final decades. The evidence remains incomplete in many inner palace matters, but the outline is clear: he rules through survival politics. At the beginning of his reign, constitutionalism appears briefly as a possible answer to imperial crisis. The Constitution of 1876 promises a parliament and a new political language of shared Ottoman citizenship. It is meant to show Europe that the empire can reform itself, and to show Ottoman subjects that unity can be built through law, rather than coercion alone. But the timing is disastrous. War with Russia erupts, the empire suffers catastrophic defeat, and Abdulhamid suspends parliament in 1878. The constitutional experiment does not disappear from memory, but it is buried under emergency rule. For the next 3 decades, the Sultan governs with a tightly controlled central authority, presenting himself as the necessary guardian of an empire too fragile for open politics. His power rests partly on information. Abdulhamid develops a vast network of surveillance reports, informants, and palace communication. The late Ottoman state under him becomes intensely watchful. Officials, students, officers, journalists, foreign visitors, and provincial figures may all be observed. Censorship expands. Newspapers are restricted. Books are examined. Words associated with rebellion, assassination, or dangerous political ideas can attract attention. This creates an atmosphere of caution that many educated Ottomans find suffocating. Yet from Abdulhamid's perspective, suspicion is not madness alone. He has seen rulers deposed, provinces revolt, creditors take control, and European powers use internal dissent as an excuse for intervention. His fear has roots in real danger, even when its methods become destructive. Abdulhamid also understands symbols. He emphasizes the Islamic role of the Sultan Caliph more strongly than many earlier rulers, especially as the empire loses Christian majority territories and becomes proportionally more Muslim. Pan-Islamic language offers a way to bind Muslims across the empire and beyond it, from Anatolia to Syria, Iraq, Arabia, North Africa, India, and Central Asia. The Ottoman Sultan presents himself as protector of Muslims in a world of European empires. This message matters deeply in an age when Muslim populations are falling under British, French, Russian, and Dutch rule. But scholars still debate how far this pan-Islamic appeal truly reaches in practical political terms. It is powerful as symbolism, useful in diplomacy, and meaningful to many, but it cannot erase local grievances, Arab provincial ambitions, Kurdish autonomy, Albanian nationalism, or the empire's material weaknesses. Railways become one of the most visible tools of Abdulhamid's rule. The Hijaz Railway, begun in the early 20th century, is designed to connect Damascus toward Medina, strengthening pilgrimage routes and military access to Arabia. It is funded in part through donations from Muslims across the world, making it both infrastructure and religious political statement. The project shows the strange mixture of modernity and tradition in Abdulhamid's empire steel tracks laid across old pilgrimage landscapes, telegraph lines, beside sacred routes, modern engineering serving the image of Islamic unity. A lesser-known detail is how emotionally powerful the railway fund becomes for some Muslims far beyond Ottoman borders who see even small donations as participation in the defence of the holy places. Yet the railway also alarms local powers, and later becomes a target in wartime, proving again that tools of control can become symbols of vulnerability. Education expands under Abdulhamid, though always under watchful eyes. New schools train officials, officers, doctors, engineers, and teachers. The state needs modern expertise, and the Sultan knows it. But educated men are dangerous. They read, compare, criticize, and imagine alternatives. Many future opponents of Abdulhamid emerge from the very institutions the late Ottoman state creates to strengthen itself. The contradiction of Tanzimat reform continues under a more authoritarian surface. The empire must produce modern minds, then tries to prevent those minds from becoming politically modern in ways that threaten the throne. The Armenian question becomes one of the darkest and most consequential crises of his reign. Armenians had long been part of the Ottoman world, especially in eastern Anatolia, and major cities with varied social positions ranging from peasants to merchants, artisans, intellectuals and officials. In the 19th century, Armenian reform demands grow in response to insecurity tax abuses, Kurdish tribal violence, local power struggles, and hopes raised by European diplomacy. Some Armenian revolutionary groups emerge seeking attention and change, though they represent only part of a much larger and diverse Armenian population. Abdulhamid's state sees Armenian activism through the lens of separatism and foreign manipulation. The result is catastrophic. In the 1890s, large-scale massacres of Armenians occur across parts of the empire, killing tens of thousands, and perhaps more, with estimates varying widely. No responsible account can treat this as a minor disturbance. It reveals how imperial fear, local violence, communal resentment, and authoritarian repression can combine into mass killing. These massacres damage the empire's international reputation and deepen internal mistrust. European outrage is loud but uneven, often mixed with strategic calculation, and rarely followed by consistent protection. For many Armenians, the violence proves that Ottoman promises of reform cannot be trusted. For many Ottoman Muslims, especially those shaped by refugee memories and fear of partition, Armenian activism is seen through a defensive and often distorted lens. This mutual fear does not excuse violence, but it helps explain the emotional atmosphere in which later disasters become possible. The late Ottoman world is becoming one in which communities increasingly imagine survival against one another rather than with one another. Abdulhamid's foreign policy is cautious, patient, and often skillful. He avoids major wars for much of his reign after the disaster of 1877 to 1878. He plays European powers against one another, drawing closer to Germany without fully surrendering to it, managing Britain, France, Russia, and Austria-Hungary as best he can. He knows the empire cannot afford another great defeat. His diplomacy is the diplomacy of a state that must not be caught alone. In this sense, his reign does preserve the empire. For 3 decades, despite rebellions, financial constraints, and foreign pressure, the Ottoman state remains intact enough to continue. But preservation has a cost. Political life is compressed. Open debate is restricted. Opposition moves into exile, secret societies, military circles, and underground networks. The Young Turks, a broad and varied opposition movement rather than one simple group, begin to see Abdulhamid's rule as the obstacle to saving the empire. Many of them believe that constitutional government science, progress, and civic unity can revive Ottoman strength. Others carry more nationalist or centralizing ideas. Their common enemy is the palace autocracy. The longer Abdulhamid suppresses politics, the more politics returns in conspiratorial forms. His rule also cannot solve the empire's structural problems. Debt remains. Foreign control remains. Nationalism continues. The Balkans grow more unstable. Crete slips from effective Ottoman control. Macedonia becomes a zone of competing armed movements and European reform schemes. Arab provinces remain loyal in many places but restless in others. The army modernizes unevenly. Officers resent favoritism and surveillance. The state is held together, but sometimes like a vessel sealed under pressure. The cracks are not gone. They're hidden, patched, watched, and feared. By 1908, the pressure bursts. Officers and activists connected to the Committee of Union and Progress forced the restoration of the constitution. Abdulhamid yields and crowds celebrate across the empire with a joy that briefly seems to dissolve decades of suspicion. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Turks, Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, and others appear in public scenes of constitutional brotherhood. For a moment, the empire imagines that the old sickness has been cured by liberty. But the moment is fragile. The empire has not escaped debt, nationalism, foreign ambition, or communal fear. It has only opened the door to politics again, and what rushes through that door will be hope, anger, faction, revenge, and a new generation convinced that they can save the Ottoman world before it is too late. The revolution of 1908 begins with the feeling of a locked room suddenly open to air. For years, Abdulhamid's empire has lived under suspicion, censorship, informants, and careful silence. Then the constitution is restored, parliament returns, and public life erupts with an intensity that reveals how much pressure had been stored beneath the surface. Newspapers multiply, political clubs appear, exiles come home, crowds gather in the streets, old slogans of Ottoman brotherhood are revived with fresh emotion. For a brief and almost unreal moment, many people believe the empire may yet be saved, not by fear but by liberty. The Young Turks are often spoken of as if they are one unified force, but the reality is more complicated. They include officers, bureaucrats, intellectuals, exiles, students, doctors, journalists and activists with different visions of the future. The Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, becomes the most powerful organization among them, but even it contains rival tendencies. Some members believe in Ottomanism, hoping constitutional equality can bind the empire's peoples together. Some emphasize centralization, discipline, state power. Some increasingly think in terms of Turkish identity, especially after repeated territorial losses. Others simply want to end palace autocracy and restore lawful government. What unites them in 1908 is not a finished program, but the conviction that Abdulhamid's rule has become fatal to the empire's survival. The joy of 1908 is real, but it rests on fragile assumptions. Many Armenians welcome constitutional restoration, hoping it will bring security and equal rights. Many Arabs see a chance for more representative politics and provincial influence. Many Jews, Greeks, Bulgarians, Albanians, and others participate in celebrations of a renewed Ottoman citizenship. Muslims who had suffered under palace repression also rejoice. Yet each group carries different memories and expectations. Ottoman brotherhood means different things in Salonika, Istanbul, Beirut, Damascus, Erzurum, Jerusalem, and Baghdad. It can mean equality, decentralization, security reform, parliamentary voice, or relief from surveillance. The phrase is beautiful because it is broad and dangerous because it is vague. Almost immediately, the empire's enemies and rivals test the new order. In 1908, Austria-Hungary formally annexes Bosnia-Herzegovina, which it had occupied since 1878, but which still technically belonged to the Ottoman Empire. Bulgaria declares full independence. Crete moves closer to union with Greece. These blows expose the limits of constitutional enthusiasm. The restored parliament cannot reverse geopolitical reality. The empire has changed its government, but its weakness remains visible to others. This is one of the cruel lessons of the revolution. Liberty may transform internal politics, but it does not automatically restore lost power. Inside the empire, the return of politics unleashes conflicts that autocracy had suppressed rather than solved. Parties and factions argue over centralization, decentralization, religion, ethnicity, the army provincial rights, and the pace of reform. The CUP fears that too much decentralization will dissolve the empire. Many Arab, Armenian, Albanian, and other leaders fear that centralization will become domination by a narrow ruling elite in Istanbul, and increasingly by Turkish-speaking bureaucrats and officers. Scholars still debate when Ottomanism gives way decisively to Turkish nationalism within the CUP, but the pressure of events clearly pushes many unionists toward a harder vision of state unity. The counter-revolution of 1909 reveals how unstable the new order is. A revolt in Istanbul involving religious conservatives, disaffected soldiers, and opponents of Cup influence calls for the restoration of Islamic law and challenges the constitutional regime. The Action Army marches from Salonika to suppress the uprising. Abdülhamid II is deposed and replaced by Mehmed V, a sultan with far less personal power. The CUP does not yet rule openly as a dictatorship, but its influence grows. The message is unmistakable. The constitution survives not through peaceful consensus alone, but through armed force. A revolution made in the name of liberty begins to rely on the army as guardian. A lesser-known detail of this moment is the importance of Salonika, one of the empire's most cosmopolitan cities. Before its loss in the Balkan Wars, Salonika is home to Muslims, Jews, Greeks, Bulgarians, Donmi communities, merchants, workers, officers and radicals. It is a port city full of languages, schools, printing presses, secret societies and European connections. The CUP's roots there are not accidental. Salonika embodies both the promise and peril of the late empire diversity-modernity conspiracy, commerce, nationalism and imperial fragility, all compressed into one urban world. When the empire later loses Salonika, it loses not only territory, but one of the environments that shaped its last revolutionary generation. The Adana massacres of 1909 darken the constitutional moment. In the province of Adana, violence against Armenians kills thousands, with estimates varying, and exposes the terrifying gap between constitutional ideals and local realities. The causes are complex counter-revolutionary tensions, Muslim fears, Armenian hopes for equality, local rivalries, rumours, class resentment and weak authority all play roles. But the result is clear. The promise of Ottoman brotherhood is stained almost immediately by mass violence. For Armenians, the massacres are a warning that the end of Abdülhamid does not guarantee safety. For Unionists, they reveal how quickly disorder can threaten the state. No single explanation fully accounts for the violence, but it shows that mistrust has sunk deep into the empire's social fabric. The Young Turk period also brings renewed efforts at modernization. The army's reorganized, administration is tightened, education, law and infrastructure remain priorities. Officers look to European models, especially German military expertise. The state tries to become more efficient, more centralized and more disciplined. But efficiency can feel like coercion in provinces accustomed to local autonomy. In Albania, resistance grows against centralizing measures and cultural restrictions. In Arab provinces, many elites continue to work within the Ottoman system, but demand greater respect for local language and administrative rights. In Macedonia, rival armed groups and reform schemes keep tensions high. The empire is trying to modernize its control over places where control itself is increasingly contested. Italian invasion of Libya in 1911 delivers another shock. Italy, eager for colonial prestige, attacks the Ottoman province of Tripolitania. The empire is too weak at sea to defend Libya effectively. Ottoman officers, including the young Mustafa Kemal, travel secretly to organize resistance with local forces, but the state cannot prevent the loss. The war shows how vulnerable distant provinces have become. It also reveals the predatory nature of the imperial age. Even a relatively new European power can seize Ottoman territory when opportunity appears. Libya's loss is painful in itself, but its timing is worse. It encourages the Balkan states to believe the empire is too distracted and weak to resist a coordinated attack. By this point, hope has begun to harden into fear. The Cup and its rivals no longer debate in a calm constitutional garden. They operate in a collapsing geopolitical environment. Every concession may invite separation. Every revolt may be backed by a foreign power. Every province may become another Bosnia, Bulgaria, Crete or Libya. The Unionists increasingly conclude that survival requires discipline, centralization, and suspicion. Their opponents conclude that cup control threatens the empire's diversity. The gap between saving the empire and controlling it becomes dangerously narrow. The revolution that began with public joy thus moves toward a darker politics. It does not fail because its ideals were meaningless. It fails because those ideals face forces stronger than speeches: nationalism, foreign aggression, communal mistrust, military weakness, and the brutal speed of crisis. The Ottoman Empire after 1908 is more politically alive than it has been in decades, but it is also more exposed. Autocracy had hidden many fractures. Constitutional life reveals them in daylight, and soon the empire will face a catastrophe so sudden that even its hardened officers are stunned. The near-total loss of its remaining European lands in the Balkan Wars, a disaster that turns fear into trauma and transforms the final Ottoman state into something narrower, angrier, and far more desperate. The Balkan Wars strike the Ottoman Empire with the force of a door slamming shut on centuries of history. For generations, Ottoman Europe has been shrinking, but it has not vanished. The empire still holds Macedonia, Thrace, Albania, in a contested imperial sense, and the old city of Salonika with its crowded docks, printed newspapers, Jewish neighborhoods, Muslim officials, Greek merchants, soldiers, schools, and secret political circles. These lands are not distant possessions in the imperial imagination. They are part of the world that made the empire what it is. Many Ottoman leaders themselves come from Balkan towns and cities. Many officers who dream of saving the state have grown up among its mixed languages and rival flags. Then within a few terrible months almost all of it is gone. In 1912 the Balkan League forms as Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece and Montenegro coordinate against the Ottoman Empire. Their alliance is fragile and filled with competing ambitions, but it is strong enough for the immediate purpose. The Ottomans are weakened by the recent war with Italy over Libya, by internal political conflict, by military disorganization, and by the dangerous belief that their enemies may not cooperate effectively. When war begins, Ottoman forces suffer rapid and shocking defeats. Armies retreat, fortresses are isolated, roads fill with soldiers, civilians, animals, carts, rumours and panic. The imperial map changes faster than officials in Istanbul can emotionally absorb. The loss of Salonika is especially devastating. The city surrenders to Greek forces in November 1912, and with it disappears one of the late empire's most important urban worlds. Salonika had been a cradle of young Turk politics, a place of officers, radicals, merchants, Jewish intellectual life, European influence and Ottoman cosmopolitanism. Its fall is not only strategic, it is intimate. Men who helped restore the constitution now see the city associated with their revolution pass out of Ottoman hands. The empire loses a port, a population, a memory, and a symbol of the diverse imperial future that had seemed briefly possible in 1908. What survives in the record suggests that this psychological wound runs deep among Unionist officers and officials. The military disaster exposes problems that had been building for years. Ottoman armies are not simply cowardly or incapable, and many units fight under miserable conditions. But command is divided. Mobilization is uneven supply, is poor disease spreads, and political interference damages coordination. Some soldiers arrive without proper equipment. Some units are exhausted before they reach the front. Railways and roads do not move men efficiently enough. Rivalries among officers weaken trust. The empire has spent decades discussing military reform, but reform on paper cannot instantly produce battlefield coherence. No single explanation fully accounts for the scale of defeat, yet the result is undeniable. The Ottoman army expected to defend what remains of Europe collapses across multiple fronts. The human disaster is even greater than the military one. Muslim civilians flee advancing armies and irregular violence, joining a long history of refugees from lost Ottoman lands. Families abandon villages where their ancestors had lived for generations. They carry bedding copper pots, children, old people, and whatever animals can still walk. Many die from hunger, disease, exposure, or attack. Some Christian communities also suffer violence and displacement in the chaos, depending on local conditions and shifting control. The Balkan Wars are not a clean story of liberation on one side and defeat on the other. They are a violent remaking of mixed lands where every army and irregular force carries its own fears, revenge, and ambitions. The evidence remains incomplete for many local atrocities, but the pattern of suffering is unmistakable. Refugees transform Ottoman politics. The empire had already received waves of Muslim migrants from Crimea, the Caucasus, and earlier Balkan losses. Now the flood intensifies. These people arrive with grief and anger, and their presence strengthens the belief among many Ottoman Muslims that coexistence under empire has failed because Christians backed by foreign powers and nationalist states will drive Muslims from Europe whenever Ottoman authority weakens. This belief does not arise from imagination alone. It is fed by real expulsions and violence, but it also narrows political vision. It makes compromise with remaining Christian communities seem more dangerous. It gives hardliners emotional ground. In the years ahead, this refugee memory will become one of the darker forces shaping Ottoman decisions. The Balkan states themselves soon quarrel over the spoils. The Second Balkan War in 1913 breaks out when Bulgaria turns against its former allies and is then attacked by Serbia, Greece, Romania, and the Ottomans. In the confusion, Ottoman forces recover. Edirne, the old Adrianople, a city of immense historical and symbolic importance. Its recapture brings a brief surge of relief. Edirne had been an early Ottoman capital before Constantinople, and losing it had felt almost unbearable. Taking it back allows the empire to preserve a small foothold in Europe beyond Istanbul. But this victory cannot hide the larger truth. The Ottoman Empire has lost nearly all its European territories. A civilization that once pressed to the gates of Vienna now clings to eastern Thrace. The political consequences in Istanbul are severe. In January 1913, the Cup carries out a coup known as the Raid on the Sublime Porte. Enver Bey and other unionist figures force a change in government, and in the violence the war minister Nazım Pasha is killed. The coup marks a decisive shift. The empire's constitutional politics give way increasingly to unionist domination. The Cup leadership becomes convinced that hesitation, decentralization, and old-style politics have nearly destroyed the state. From their perspective, only a disciplined, centralized, nationalist-minded government can prevent final collapse. Their opponents see something else. A movement that once promised liberty, now seizing power by force. Scholars still debate the exact balance of ideology, panic and ambition inside the Cup, but after the Balkan catastrophe, Ottoman politics is unmistakably harsher. The empire also becomes demographically and emotionally more Muslim. This does not mean that non-Muslims disappear from Ottoman lands, but the loss of much of the Balkans removes large Christian populations from the empire, while refugee flows increase the Muslim population of Anatolia and Thrace. The old Ottoman ideal of a multi-religious imperial balance becomes harder to sustain. Ottomanism, already weakened, now seems to many unionists like a beautiful failure. Turkish identity, Muslim solidarity, and state survival move closer together in their thinking, though not always in a simple or consistent way. The empire's future is imagined less as a broad imperial mosaic and more as a defended core. A lesser-known consequence of the Balkan Wars is the effect on younger officers who will later shape the Middle East and modern Turkey. Men who witness retreat refugee columns, foreign intervention, and administrative chaos come away with a fierce fear of weakness. Mustafa Kemal Enver Talat Kemal and many others are shaped by this age of collapse. They see that an empire can lose ancient lands in weeks. They see that international sympathy does not protect the defeated. They see that mixed populations can become targets when state power fails. These lessons are not gentle. They harden a generation. By 1914, the Ottoman Empire stands smaller, poorer, angrier, and more desperate than it had been only a few years before. It has lost Libya. It has lost almost all of Europe. It has taken in refugees it can barely support. Its army is being reorganized with German assistance. Its ruling party fears enemies inside and outside the state. Its treasury remains strained. Its diplomacy is anxious. Its leaders know that another war among the great powers may be coming, and they fear being left isolated when it arrives. The Balkan catastrophe does not directly cause the empire's final decision to enter World War I, but it creates the emotional and strategic world in which that decision becomes thinkable. The empire's rulers no longer believe that neutrality alone can guarantee survival. They have seen what happens when stronger powers choose the fate of Ottoman lands. They have seen how fast territory can vanish. They have seen how defeat fills roads with the dispossessed. Now, when Europe approaches the edge of general war, some Ottoman leaders will look at the danger and see one last chance. It is a terrible gamble, but to men who believe the empire is already being slowly strangled, even a terrible gamble can appear like a form of hope. The Ottoman Empire enters the First World War not as a power confident of easy victory, but as a wounded state searching for protection, revenge, and a way out of slow dismemberment. Its leaders know the empire is vulnerable. They have seen Libya taken by Italy, Bosnia, absorbed by Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Greece, escape Ottoman rule, and almost all of Ottoman Europe lost in the Balkan Wars. They have watched refugees crowd into Anatolia and Thrace, carrying stories that make defeat feel not only political but existential. Neutrality might seem safer from a distance, but to the men ruling in Istanbul, neutrality also looks dangerous. A weak empire standing alone may simply become the prize of whichever side wins. The Committee of Union and Progress dominates Ottoman politics by 1914, with figures such as Enver Talat and Cemal holding enormous influence. They do not all think identically, and Ottoman decision-making in these months remains a subject of historical debate. Some leaders lean toward Germany because German military missions have helped reorganize the army, because Germany has no large colonial empire carved from Ottoman lands, and because alliance with Berlin may balance the threats of Russia, Britain, and France. Britain's seizure of 2 Ottoman battleships being built in British yards, ships partly paid for by public subscription, adds bitterness. For many Ottomans, the episode feels like proof that Britain cannot be trusted when imperial survival is at stake. The German warships Goeben and Breslau arriving in Ottoman waters and transferred in name to Ottoman service deepen the connection with Germany and help pull the empire toward war. The decision is not simply forced by Berlin, though German influence matters. Ottoman leaders make their own gamble. They hope that by joining the Central Powers they can recover lost territory, escape financial dependence, end humiliating capitulations, and secure the empire against Russia. The calculation is desperate but not irrational in their own context. If Germany wins quickly, the Ottomans may survive as a restored great power. If the empire remains neutral, and Russia or Britain dominates the post-war settlement, Ottoman sovereignty may shrink further. No single explanation fully accounts for the choice, but fear and ambition are tightly bound together. the empire enters war because its rulers believe the risks of action may be less fatal than the risks of waiting. War arrives officially after Ottoman naval attacks on Russian ports in the Black Sea in late 1914. Soon the empire is fighting on multiple fronts across a vast and difficult geography. The Caucasus front against Russia becomes a frozen disaster, especially after Enver Pasha's winter campaign towards Sarıkamış. Ottoman forces suffer catastrophic losses from cold, hunger, exhaustion, disease and combat. Soldiers freeze in the mountains before they can even reach battle in proper order. The defeat exposes the deadly gap between strategic dreams and logistical reality. It also intensifies suspicion toward Armenian communities in eastern Anatolia, where Russian advances Armenian volunteer units on the Russian side, local self-defense, Ottoman paranoia, and wartime collapse become entangled in ways that lead toward catastrophe. In 1915, the Ottoman government begins the deportation of Armenians from Anatolia and other regions, presenting the policy as a wartime security measure. The result is mass death on an enormous scale. Armenians are forced from homes, marched through deserts and hostile landscapes, attacked by bands, deprived of food and water, and killed in massacres. Many historians and numerous governments recognize these events as genocide. Turkish official narratives have long disputed that term, emphasizing war, rebellion, disease, and mutual suffering. But the scale, pattern, and intent behind the deportations remain central to scholarly condemnation. For the human beings caught in it, the debate over terminology cannot soften the reality. Ancient communities are shattered, families are destroyed, and the moral landscape of the empire is permanently darkened. The evidence remains incomplete in some local details, but the broader devastation is undeniable. At Gallipoli, however, the Ottoman army achieves one of its most famous victories. In 1915, British and French forces, including troops from Australia and New Zealand, try to force the Dardanelles capture Istanbul and open a supply route to Russia. The campaign becomes a brutal struggle of cliffs trenches, disease, heat flies, mud and narrow beaches. Ottoman soldiers fight with extraordinary determination, under commanders who understand the terrain and the stakes. Mustafa Kemal emerges as one of the key figures in the defense, gaining prestige that will matter greatly after the war. Gallipoli does not win the war for the Ottomans, but it prevents a swift Allied breakthrough and gives the empire a rare and powerful victory in an age of losses. The victory carries symbolic force. Istanbul is protected. The straits remain closed to Allied shipping. Russia remains more isolated from its partners. Ottoman morale rises at least for a time, yet Gallipoli also consumes lives on a terrible scale. Soldiers from Anatolian villages, Arab provinces, Balkan refugee families, and many other parts of the empire die in trenches that become sacred in later memory. A lesser-known truth is that Ottoman wartime endurance depends not only on dramatic battles, but on the constant sacrifice of ordinary conscripts whose names rarely enter history. They march, dig, freeze, thirst, and die in landscapes far from home, often with little understanding of the grand strategy that sent them there. In Mesopotamia, the war moves along rivers, marshes, deserts, and old imperial routes. British forces advance from the Persian Gulf to protect oil interests and imperial communications. The Ottoman army defeats and captures a British Indian force at Kut in 1916, one of Britain's most humiliating defeats of the war. But this success is temporary. British forces regroup, improve logistics, and take Baghdad in 1917. The fall of Baghdad is more than a military loss. It is the loss of a city with immense historical weight, a former Abbasid capital, and a symbol of Islamic civilization. The Ottoman Empire is now losing not only frontiers, but storied centers of its eastern world. In the Arab provinces, the war strains imperial loyalty. Many Arab soldiers continue to serve in Ottoman armies, and many Arab notables remain cautious or loyal. The later image of a united Arab revolt against Ottoman rule is too simple. Still resentment towards CUP centralization, wartime requisitions, executions of Arab activists by Kemal Pasha famine in Greater Syria, and British promises to Sharif Hussein of Mecca create conditions for revolt. In 1916, the Arab revolt begins in the Hijaz with British support. Its military role is debated, but its political meaning is immense. The Ottoman claim to protect the holy cities is broken when Mecca and later other areas slip from its control. The empire's Islamic legitimacy, carefully cultivated by Abdul Hamid and still vital to wartime appeals, is wounded in the Arabian Peninsula itself. The famine in Syria and Lebanon adds another layer of suffering. Blockades, locusts, requisitions, military priorities, transport failures, and administrative harshness combine to produce mass hunger. Civilians die in great numbers, especially in Mount Lebanon and surrounding areas. This disaster is sometimes overshadowed by battlefield narratives, but it shows how imperial collapse reaches into kitchens, fields, markets, and family graves. War is not only armies moving on maps. It is the disappearance of bread, the silence of villages, the selling of possessions for flour, the weakening of children, and the moral exhaustion of communities trapped between empire and blockade. By 1917 and 1918, the Ottoman war effort is weakening. Russia's revolution removes one enemy from the Eastern Front and allows the Ottomans briefly to regain territory in the Caucasus, even reaching toward old ambitions in Baku and beyond. But this Eastern hope cannot compensate for collapse elsewhere. British forces under General Allenby break through in Palestine, taking Jerusalem in 1917 and Damascus in 1918. The fall of Jerusalem, like Baghdad, carries symbolic weight far beyond military value. The empire that once guarded the great cities of the eastern Mediterranean is now retreating from them under the pressure of modern war. The final gamble has failed. The alliance with Germany has not restored Ottoman greatness. It has brought invasion, famine, deportation, massacre, and exhaustion. Still, the empire does not simply vanish on the battlefield. It is worn down across fronts that reveal all its old weaknesses. Poor logistics, financial strain, contested loyalties, foreign intervention, nationalist movements, and the difficulty of holding distant provinces under modern war conditions. Yet its soldiers also prove that the empire is not a corpse. At Gallipoli Cut and many smaller actions they fight fiercely. The tragedy is that courage cannot save a state whose strategic position has become almost impossible. By the autumn of 1918, Bulgaria has collapsed, Germany is failing, and the Ottoman Empire is exposed. The armistice becomes unavoidable. The rulers who gambled on war now face defeat, occupation, and judgment. The empire has survived centuries of crisis, but this time survival as an empire is slipping away. What remains is not peace, but the beginning of reckoning. Foreign troops in Ottoman lands, partition plans written by victors' trials and escapes, nationalist resistance, and the painful question of what can still be saved from the ruins. Defeat comes to the Ottoman Empire not as silence but as arrival. Allied ships enter the waters near Istanbul. Foreign soldiers appear in streets, barracks, ports, railway stations, and government buildings. The old capital, which had survived siege crisis, reform revolution, and war, now lives under the shadow of occupation. The domes and minarets still stand. Ferries still cross the Bosporus. Markets still open. Families still search for bread news and missing relatives. Yet the meaning of power has changed. The empire's heart is still beating, but others now stand close enough to count the pulse. The Armistice of Mudros, signed in October 1918, ends Ottoman participation in the First World War and gives the Allies wide rights to occupy strategic points. Its language is technical, but its consequences are sweeping. The Ottoman army is demobilized. Forts, railways, ports, and communications become vulnerable to Allied control. Provinces already lost in practice are now lost in expectation. The government in Istanbul remains, but its authority is hollowed out by defeat, foreign pressure, and internal fear. What survives in the record suggests a capital filled with uncertainty, officials trying to preserve something, soldiers returning home, refugees searching for safety, political factions blaming one another, and ordinary people living through the strange humiliation of imperial endings. The wartime leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress flee. Enver Talat and Kemal leave the empire aware that defeat will bring accusation and revenge. Their departure does not close the question of responsibility. Trials are held, documents are gathered. Crimes committed during the war, including the destruction of the Armenians, cannot simply disappear into the smoke of battle. Yet justice in a defeated empire is unstable. It is shaped by foreign pressure, domestic politics, missing records, escaped leaders, and the desire of new actors to distance themselves from the fallen regime. Scholars still debate many details of the post-war trials and their political context, but the moral weight of the wartime catastrophes remains. The empire has not only lost territory, it has lost the ability to tell a clean story about itself. Across Anatolia and beyond, violence and insecurity continue. Armenians who survive deportation face an uncertain and often dangerous return. Greek communities fear retaliation and political upheaval. Muslim refugees and villagers remember the Balkan wars and wartime suffering. Kurds, Turks, Armenians, Greeks, Arabs, Circassians and others live amid shifting authority, armed bands, local revenge, famine, disease and rumour. The end of war does not restore order. It opens a new struggle over who will control the remains. No single explanation fully accounts for the violence of these years, because it grows from state collapse, ethnic fear, revenge, foreign occupation, local ambition, and the unresolved wounds of the previous decade. The Allied powers arrive with promises and plans that do not always match one another. Britain, France, Italy, and Greece all have interests in Ottoman lands. Earlier secret agreements, including the Sykes-Picot arrangement between Britain and France, had already imagined the division of Arab provinces into spheres of influence. The Balfour Declaration has added another layer of future conflict in Palestine. Arab leaders who had expected independence after revolt against Ottoman rule find themselves facing European mandates. In Istanbul and Anatolia, the victors speak of order, minority protection, strategic necessity, and civilization. But beneath the language lies the old imperial habit of drawing borders around other people's futures. The occupation of Istanbul in its fuller form in 1920 turns humiliation into a political fact that can no longer be disguised. The Ottoman parliament is pressured and then effectively broken. Nationalist deputies are arrested or flee. The Sultan's government remains in the capital, but its legitimacy is increasingly contested by a new centre of resistance forming in Anatolia. Mustafa Kemal, already known for Gallipoli and later wartime service, travels to Samsun in 1919 and begins organising what becomes the Turkish national movement. At first, the movement speaks in terms of defending the rights of the Ottoman Muslim population and preserving lands not yet surrendered. Over time, it becomes the foundation of a new political order. A lesser-known detail of this transition is that the nationalist movement does not begin as an open declaration of a republic. Many of its early documents still use Ottoman language and claim loyalty, at least formally, to the Sultan Caliph under foreign captivity. This ambiguity is useful. It allows resistance to gather support from officers, local notables, religious figures, former unionist villagers, and officials who may not yet imagine abolishing the monarchy. The movement grows because it offers something the occupied imperial government cannot action defense, and the possibility that defeat is not the final word. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 represents the nightmare version of Ottoman defeat. It proposes severe partition of Ottoman lands into national control over the strait zones of influence for Italy and France, recognition of an Armenian state in the east, possible Kurdish autonomy, and Greek control over Smyrna and eastern Thrace. For many Turks and Muslims in Anatolia, Sèvres confirms the fear born in the Balkan Wars that defeat means not reform or limited punishment, but dismemberment and possible expulsion from the remaining homeland. The treaty is signed by the Istanbul government, but it is never truly implemented because the nationalist resistance rejects it and fights to overturn it. In memory, Sèvres becomes more than a treaty. It becomes a symbol of national near-death. The Greek landing at Smyrna in May 1919 becomes one of the sparks of armed resistance. Smyrna, known also as Izmir, is a cosmopolitan port city with large Greek, Turkish, Armenian, Jewish and European communities, layered commerce and deep imperial history. Greek forces land with Allied approval, claiming protection of local Greeks and historical rights. Violence accompanies the landing and Turkish outrage spreads. For Greek nationalists, the campaign is tied to the megali idea, the dream of uniting Greek-populated lands with Greece. For Turkish nationalists, it is an invasion of the Anatolian core. The war that follows is brutal, and both civilians and soldiers suffer heavily. The evidence remains incomplete in many local episodes, but the larger tragedy is clear. Mixed lands are again being forced into national futures that cannot hold all their people safely. In the East, conflict with Armenian forces and the collapse of Russian imperial authority produce another violent frontier. The short-lived Republic of Armenia faces famine, refugees, war, and impossible territorial claims in a devastated region. Turkish nationalist forces advance, and the eventual settlement leaves Armenians with far less than what had been imagined in Allied plans. In the south, French forces and Armenian auxiliaries faced Turkish nationalist resistance in Cilicia and nearby regions, producing further cycles of violence and displacement. The post-war Ottoman world is not one war but several overlapping struggles over land security, revenge and sovereignty. Meanwhile, the Arab provinces are no longer returning. Syria comes under French mandate after the defeat of Faisal's short-lived Arab kingdom in Damascus. Iraq and Palestine fall under British mandate. Arabia moves through its own transformations, with the Hashemites, Saudis and other forces reshaping the peninsula. The Ottoman claim to a universal imperial Islamic order is broken beyond repair. The empire that once connected the Balkans, Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Arabia, and North Africa, has become a memory before the legal empire itself has fully disappeared. The nationalist victory in Anatolia changes the settlement. Greek forces advance deep into western Anatolia, but are eventually stopped and driven back. The Turkish War of Independence ends with nationalist success, the burning and upheaval of Smyrna in 1922, an enormous population displacement. The human cost is staggering. Greek and Turkish civilians endure fear, flight massacre, destruction and exile. The later compulsory population exchange between Greece and Turkey formalizes a separation that had already begun through war and terror. Orthodox Christians of Anatolia and Muslims of Greece are uprooted in huge numbers, with exceptions, but also with deep trauma. A world of mixed communities, however unequal and tense it had been, gives way to harder national borders. In November 1922, the Sultanate is abolished. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, leaves aboard a British warship. The image is almost too stark. The dynasty that had begun on a frontier in Anatolia conquered Constantinople, ruled across continents and claimed the mantle of caliphate now exits under foreign protection from the capital it once possessed. Yet the ending is not merely personal. It marks the death of the Ottoman imperial state. The caliphate briefly remains under Abdulmecid II, separated from political sovereignty, but the old structure is gone. Collapse, occupation and reckoning reveal that empires do not end only through treaties. They end in kitchens, courts, prisons, ports, refugee camps, abandoned churches, emptied villages, renamed streets and memories that families carry longer than states survive. The Ottoman Empire falls from power because it loses wars, territory, money, legitimacy, and the ability to hold its peoples inside one political imagination. But its ending also gives birth to new struggles, new states, and new silences. Out of the ruins, one project will rise most clearly in Anatolia, a republic that rejects much of the Ottoman past, while inheriting its soldiers' fears, borders, and ghosts. The Ottoman Empire ends, but it does not disappear cleanly. Its dynasty falls, its ministries are dismantled, its old imperial claims are rejected, and its last political forms are swept away by a new republic. Yet the people who build that republic are not strangers who arrive from outside history. They are soldiers, officials, teachers, refugees, bureaucrats, and survivors shaped by the late Ottoman world. They carry its languages, its institutions, its fears, its wounds, and its habits of emergency. The Republic of Turkey, proclaimed in 1923 under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, presents itself as a sharp break from the empire, and in many ways it is. But beneath the break, inheritance remains. The Treaty of Lausanne replaces the unworkable Treaty of Sèvres and recognizes the sovereignty of the new Turkish state within borders far more secure than those imagined by the defeated Allies in 1920. For Turkish nationalists, Lausanne is not merely diplomacy, it is rescue from partition. It proves that armed resistance has overturned imperial humiliation. The empire could not survive, but the Anatolian core has escaped the fate many feared after the Balkan Wars and the First World War. This victory gives the Republic a powerful founding memory survival through struggle, sovereignty recovered from foreign occupation, and national rebirth after imperial collapse. The new state moves quickly to separate itself from the Ottoman order. The Sultanate is already gone. In 1924, the Caliphate is abolished, ending an institution that late Ottoman rulers had used as a pillar of legitimacy. Religious courts and schools are restructured or closed. New legal codes, alphabet reform, secular education, dress reforms, and state-led modernization all seek to create a different kind of society. Istanbul remains majestic, but Ankara becomes the capital, a symbolic shift from imperial city to republican centre. The Republic turns away from the image of a multi-continental Islamic empire and toward the idea of a modern nation-state rooted in Turkish sovereignty. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for this transformation. It is not only westernization, not only nationalism, not only rejection of religion, and not only the ambition of one leader. It is also a response to the long Ottoman fall. The Republic's centralization reflects memories of provincial separatism. Its suspicion of foreign interference reflects the age of debt, capitulations, occupation, and Sèvres. Its emphasis on national unity reflects the trauma of multi-ethnic collapse. Its military prestige reflects the fact that in the end soldiers saved what diplomats and sultans could not. What survives in the record suggests that the Republic is built not simply from hope, but from fear of repeating imperial disintegration. The Ottoman legacy also remains outside Turkey. The borders of the Middle East are shaped by the empire's absence, and by the mandates that follow its defeat. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and other political landscapes emerge from the post-war settlement not as simple continuations of Ottoman provinces, but as new structures influenced by British and French imperial decisions. Many later conflicts cannot be blamed solely on the Ottoman collapse, but the end of Ottoman rule removes a flexible if unequal imperial framework and replaces it with borders, mandates, monarchies, and nationalist projects that often struggle with diversity in new ways. Scholars still debate how different the region might have been under other settlements, but the consequences of the Ottoman ending remain visible. In the Balkans too, Ottoman memory lingers. Mosques, bridges, bathhouses, markets, loanwords, foods, music, family histories and ruins survive across lands that once fought to escape Ottoman rule. For some, the Ottoman past is remembered as occupation, for others as coexistence, loss, nostalgia, or ancestry. Often it is all of these at once. The empire's centuries in southeastern Europe cannot be reduced to either tyranny or harmony. It was a ruling order with hierarchy and violence, but also with exchange, adaptation, and shared urban life. Its disappearance left behind nations that built their identities partly against it, even while carrying traces of it in daily culture. The greatest tragedy of the empire's fall is perhaps the destruction of mixed worlds. Ottoman society had never been equal in a modern sense, and it had known rebellion, repression, and massacre long before the final collapse. Still, many of its cities and regions contained communities that lived side by side for generations, connected by markets, neighborhoods, crafts, languages, and local memories. The age of nationalist war, imperial retreat, and population exchange tore many of these worlds apart. Armenians vanished from much of Anatolia through genocide and displacement. Greeks left lands where their communities had existed for centuries. Muslims fled or were expelled from the Balkans and Caucasus into the shrinking Ottoman and then Turkish world. Jews, Arabs, Kurds, Assyrians, Circassians, Albanians, Bosniaks, and others all carried different fragments of the imperial ending. The Ottoman Empire fell from power because it could not solve the combined pressures of modern war, nationalism, financial dependency, foreign intervention, administrative strain, and internal mistrust. But its fall was not a simple morality tale of decay. It was an empire that adapted, repeatedly survived longer than predicted, and understood many of its dangers with painful clarity. Its tragedy was that reform came with costs. Centralization provoked resistance, diversity became politicized, and every defeat made the next crisis harder to manage. By the time the final war came, the empire was still alive, but it was living with too many fractures under too much weight. In the end, the Ottoman story is not only about losing power, it is about the transformation of the world that made empires possible. Dynastic legitimacy gave way to national sovereignty. Multi-ethnic imperial rule gave way to harder borders. Local bargains gave way to centralized states. Sacred authority gave way to secular bureaucratic power in some places and new religious politics in others. The Ottoman Empire did not fall into emptiness. It fell into the modern world, and its shadow remains long. It lies across maps, memories, arguments over identity, minority rights, borders, holy places, refugee histories, and the meaning of sovereignty. It remains in Istanbul's skyline, in Balkan songs in Syrian, and Iraqi provincial memories, in Armenian grief, in Turkish republican pride, in Arab debates over empire and independence, and in the uneasy knowledge that civilizations rarely end in a single moment. They dissolve, transform, and survive in the lives of those who inherit their ruins. The empire's final image is not only a fallen palace or an abandoned battlefield. It is a map slowly changing colour, a train leaving a station, a family carrying a key to a house it will never see again, a clerk folding away the seal of a vanished ministry, a soldier returning to a village where the Empire's name still means something, but no longer commands the future. It is Istanbul at dusk, still immense, still beautiful, no longer capital of a world empire, but filled with the echoes of one. The Ottoman fall reminds the modern world that power can last for centuries and still prove fragile. Institutions that seem permanent can weaken one compromise at a time. Borders that look ancient can be redrawn in a season. Communities that share streets for generations can be divided by fear war and new ideas of belonging. Yet endings are never complete. The past remains in stone language, food, law, memory and silence. It remains in what people mourn and what they choose not to remember. Across the old Ottoman lands, the traces are still there, a bridge over a Balkan river, a caravan road fading into dust, a mosque courtyard in a city that has changed rulers many times, a railway cutting through dry hills toward a horizon once imagined as imperial. The empire that rose from a frontier and stretched across continents is gone, but its afterlife continues in the questions left behind. How does a state hold difference without crushing it? How does reform save a world without breaking it? How long can power survive when the imagination that once sustained it has begun to fade? In the quiet after collapse, history does not offer a single answer. It leaves fragments, warnings, and ruins beneath the same sky that watched the empire rise.